The courtroom was filled with a low hum of chatter as people shuffled to their seats, settling into the tense atmosphere of yet another day of legal proceedings. The room, adorned with dark wood panels and looming portraits of long-dead judges, carried the weight of decades of justice and judgment. But this day was different. There was something in the air, a buzz of anticipation, something that felt almost out of place. At the center of this solemn space stood Judge Arthur Foster, a man known for his unwavering composure and no-nonsense approach to the law. He was a figure of authority, his sharp gaze slicing through anyone who dared step out of line. His robes, perfectly pressed, hung on him like a second skin, and his reputation for fairness had earned him respect across the legal world. But beneath the layers of professionalism and experience, there was something else, a quiet restlessness, a hunger for something more than just routine cases and tired faces. As the clock struck 10, the court settled into its rhythm. The bailiff announced the arrival of the next case, and everyone's attention was drawn to the front. But just as the judge opened his mouth to begin, a quiet shuffle from the back of the courtroom caught his attention. There was a slight pause, a flicker of confusion on his face. And then he saw him, Clint Eastwood. The man walked in like he owned the place, his posture exuding the kind of confidence only someone with a legendary career could carry. Clint's presence was undeniable, and yet there was something casual about the way he moved. Jeans, a well-worn leather jacket, his graying hair combed back just enough to show a hint of his former youthful swagger. He wasn't the kind of man who just walked into a courtroom unannounced. Judge Foster's eyes narrowed, his lips twitching upward into an involuntary smirk. The crowd shifted uneasily, the whispers growing louder. Clint Eastwood, was he here for a case? Or had someone mistaken him for a Hollywood star just passing through? Foster couldn't help it. A chuckle bubbled up from deep within his chest. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "What's next? Are you here to settle a legal dispute over a spaghetti western?" The court erupted into nervous laughter, and for a moment, it seemed as if the entire room had forgotten where they were. Judge Foster's smile lingered, but the man before him, Clint Eastwood, remained unfazed. Clint had heard it all before. The jokes, the disbelief, the dismissals. After all, who would expect someone like him to waltz into a courtroom in the middle of a serious trial? It wasn't the first time his life had been reduced to nothing more than the punchline of a joke. But Clint Eastwood had been in far worse situations than this. He glanced around the courtroom, his eyes briefly meeting the gaze of a few curious faces. The audience wasn't sure what to make of him yet, but they were certainly intrigued. The judge's comment was nothing new. After all, Clint had lived much of his life under the weight of public scrutiny, first as an actor, and now as a former Secret Service agent who still carried the weight of those years with him. "I'm not here for a movie, Your Honor," Clint said coolly, his voice steady, but there was a flicker of something more beneath the surface, something he wasn't yet ready to reveal. The room fell silent. Judge Foster raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Oh? Then what brings you here, Mr. Eastwood?" he asked, his tone still laced with mockery. "Surely you're not just here to make a cameo." Clint paused for a moment, his gaze locking with the judge's. He could sense the skepticism radiating from the man, but Clint had seen this before. He had dealt with far worse than this smirking judge. "I'm here to do my duty, just like everyone else," Clint said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. The judge chuckled again, shaking his head. He had a reputation for being able to read people, and this guy, this Clint Eastwood, was no exception. He had an air of mystery about him, but surely he couldn't be serious about being here for anything beyond a good laugh. "Well, Mr. Eastwood," Judge Foster said, leaning back in his chair, "I hope you're not expecting to be treated like a hero just because you've been in a few films. This is a courtroom, not a set for your next blockbuster." The audience, still uneasy, shifted in their seats, unsure of what was happening. But Clint stood his ground. He didn't flinch. His eyes never wavered from the judge's. "I wasn't expecting anything," Clint replied, his voice a calm contrast to the judge's playful taunt. "But I do expect to be treated with respect." The tension in the room began to build. Judge Foster's smirk faded, replaced by a more serious expression. He had dealt with a lot of arrogant, entitled people in his time, but there was something about Clint Eastwood that made him pause. The man wasn't intimidated. There was a weight in his words, an unspoken history that intrigued the judge. Before the judge could respond, the court assistant called the case to order. But Clint remained standing, his presence inescapable. The audience waited for him to explain himself, for the inevitable reveal of why the actor-turned-agent was here. Just as the judge was about to dismiss the situation as a joke, Clint did something unexpected. With a calm, deliberate motion, Clint reached into his jacket pocket. The courtroom held its breath. Was he reaching for a letter? A piece of evidence? No. What Clint pulled out was something far more shocking. With a flick of his wrist, Clint Eastwood flashed a badge, its sleek silver surface gleaming under the harsh lights of the courtroom. A United States Secret Service badge. Judge Foster froze, his eyes wide. The room fell silent. This wasn't just a joke. This wasn't some Hollywood star in a casual appearance. This was serious. Clint Eastwood wasn't here for a cameo. He was here on business. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Judge Arthur Foster had been in the courtroom longer than most of his colleagues had been alive. With over 3 decades of experience, he had seen it all: defendants, plaintiffs, high-profile cases, low-level disputes, and the countless lives that passed through his chambers. His reputation was well-earned, his decisions rarely challenged. He was known for his unwavering sense of justice, for his ability to remain neutral in the face of personal animosity. But beneath the surface, there were cracks that no one could see but him. It had been nearly 5 years since the divorce. His ex-wife, Laura, had left him quietly, taking their 2 children with her. Arthur had never understood why it happened, why the woman he thought he knew so well had decided to leave him. The kids had grown distant since, as well. He told himself it was all for the best, that his long hours in court had made him too detached, too focused on his work to nurture the family he once thought he would build his life around. But the truth was, he had never fully recovered. He had built a reputation in the courtroom as a man of resolve, but outside of it, he was lonely. His life was a series of cases, late nights poring over legal documents, and quick meals in the office. The world outside the courthouse seemed distant, foreign. His personal life had become nothing more than a series of missed opportunities, missed phone calls, missed birthdays, and an overwhelming sense of regret. There were those who tried to reach out to him, people who could see the hollow man beneath the polished judge. His colleagues, some of the young up-and-comers in the legal world, had invited him to dinner, tried to pull him out of his shell. But Arthur had learned long ago that when you give too much of yourself to others, you end up with nothing for yourself. So, he stayed in the shadows of his office, poring over case files late into the night. The files never judged him. They never abandoned him. But today was different. Today, Clint Eastwood had walked into his courtroom, and everything seemed to shift. Arthur Foster knew the stories. Everyone did. Clint Eastwood was a man who had fought battles on screen and off. An actor turned Secret Service agent. A man of few words, but when he spoke, everyone listened. Yet there was something about Clint that unsettled Arthur. The way Clint didn't flinch when the judge made his sarcastic comment. The quiet power that seemed to emanate from him. This wasn't a man who sought the spotlight, at least, not in the way others did. No, this man had a different kind of presence, a type of authority that couldn't be dismissed with a joke. For the first time in years, Arthur felt that familiar sensation of being out of control. He didn't like it. He liked being the one in charge, the one who held the power. He had built his life around that sense of control, of knowing exactly where he stood in the world. But Clint's sudden appearance had rattled him. As Arthur sat at his desk, watching the exchange between Clint and the rest of the courtroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been thrust into something much larger than himself. This wasn't a celebrity making a surprise appearance. This was a man who held the weight of something far more important, something Arthur couldn't even begin to fathom. He leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath, the weight of his own personal demons pressing down on him. The case before him was a serious one, involving allegations of corruption in the local police department, but the more Arthur thought about Clint Eastwood, the more he wondered if this was just a distraction. He had dealt with corruption before. He had seen it all. But this felt different. This felt like it was personal. Arthur had once been an idealist. When he first took the bench, he had dreams of making a difference, of being the kind of judge who would always fight for the underdog, who would hold the powerful accountable. But as the years passed, he began to see the world in shades of gray. The law wasn't always about justice. It was about winning, about power. And those who had power were always the ones who dictated the rules. In the quiet of his chambers, Arthur thought back to his early days as a lawyer. He had been ambitious then, full of energy and ideals. He had always believed that he could change the system, but that belief had been eroded over time. The more he saw of the world, the more disillusioned he became. The law was not about fairness. It was about who could outlast whom. The courtroom had become his battleground, but it was a battle he was beginning to feel too tired to fight. It was then that his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at his door. "Your Honor," a young clerk said nervously, peeking her head inside. "Are you ready to proceed with the case?" Arthur straightened in his chair, quickly wiping away the moment of vulnerability. He couldn't afford to let anyone see him like this. "Of course," he said, his voice regaining its usual firmness. "Let's continue." But as the clerk left and the sound of the courtroom buzzed again, Arthur couldn't help but glance toward Clint, who was still standing in the back, his presence as imposing as ever. For reasons he couldn't fully understand, the judge knew that today was going to be a turning point. Something big was about to happen, and Clint Eastwood was at the center of it all. The judge's fingers drummed on the desk, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension settling into his chest. This wasn't just a normal day in court. This was a day that would change everything. The quiet buzz of the courtroom persisted, but now there was a layer of unease hanging over the proceedings. People whispered behind their hands, stealing glances at Clint Eastwood as he stood with his arms crossed, that impenetrable gaze fixed forward. It wasn't just his presence. There was something about the way he held himself that demanded attention, as if he were a man who had lived 100 lives and could still take on whatever challenge was thrown his way. Judge Foster couldn't shake the feeling that Clint wasn't here by accident. The presence of the badge alone was enough to throw everything into chaos. A Secret Service badge. This wasn't just a former actor trying to make a joke or pull a stunt for the cameras. This was someone who had served, someone who had operated in the shadows, someone who didn't walk into a courtroom for nothing. "Mr. Eastwood," Judge Foster's voice cut through the murmur, his eyes locking with Clint's. "You've made your point. You're here to perform your duty, as you put it. But I'm afraid this court has a procedure to follow, and I won't tolerate distractions." The words were calm, collected, but there was a fire underneath. Judge Foster had prided himself on maintaining order in his courtroom. He was the authority here. He kept the rules. And now, with Clint Eastwood standing in the back, the foundations of that authority felt like they were crumbling beneath him. Clint didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the judge when the words were spoken, his gaze still fixed ahead, his posture as rigid as the steel underbelly of a tank. The silence in the room stretched on, thick with tension. The audience waited for something, anything, to happen next. Arthur Foster knew he couldn't let this go on. The courtroom needed to proceed. It had to. He turned his attention back to the case at hand, pushing Clint's unexpected arrival to the back of his mind. But the problem was, Clint wasn't willing to let it go. "I'll respect your rules, Your Honor," Clint said, finally breaking his silence. His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it, something dangerous lurking beneath the calm surface. "But this isn't just a distraction. This is something much bigger." Foster narrowed his eyes. "Bigger than what?" he asked, his patience starting to wear thin. "Bigger than the law? This is a courtroom, Mr. Eastwood, not your personal stage." The room fell quiet, the weight of Clint's words hanging in the air like a thick fog. No one knew what he meant. What was bigger than the law? And why had Clint Eastwood, an actor, a former Secret Service agent, walked in with such gravitas today? Clint's eyes met the judge's, his stare unflinching. "You may be right about one thing," Clint began slowly, his voice heavy with purpose. "This is a courtroom, but the law is never just black and white. Sometimes, the truth is hidden in the shadows. And sometimes, people in positions of power make sure it stays that way. A ripple of tension moved through the courtroom. The words were cryptic, but the intensity in Clint's voice was undeniable. It wasn't just a statement. It was a warning. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. Something about Clint's tone made him feel like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. He couldn't afford to let this go on. "Enough," Foster snapped, his voice cutting through the quiet. He slapped the gavel down on the desk, the sharp sound reverberating through the room. "This court will proceed as scheduled. If you have something to say, Mr. Eastwood, you'll do so in the proper manner." Clint didn't move. His eyes were locked onto Foster's with the intensity of a man who had seen far worse than any courtroom drama. "I think you need to hear what I have to say, Your Honor," Clint said, his voice unwavering. "This isn't a game. There are things happening right under your nose, and the people in this room are too blind to see it." The crowd shifted uneasily, murmurs growing louder as the tension between Clint and the judge escalated. For a brief moment, it almost felt like the room had transformed into a battle zone. The courtroom no longer just a space for legal proceedings, but a war ground for something much more significant. Foster's gaze hardened. He was used to challenges, but Clint was not like the others. He didn't cower. He didn't back down. And as much as Foster wanted to dismiss him, there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind that Clint Eastwood knew something he didn't. That feeling dug into him like a splinter, growing deeper with every word. "Mr. Eastwood," Judge Foster said, his tone colder now, "if you think you have information that could alter the course of this trial, then you will follow the proper channels. You will address this court through your attorney." Clint shook his head slightly, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You don't understand, do you?" he said softly, almost to himself. "This isn't about the trial. This is about something bigger. This is about people who think they can pull the strings without anyone noticing." The judge's jaw tightened. This was not just about a courtroom case anymore. Whatever Clint was hinting at, it felt like it had the potential to rip open something far more dangerous than a simple legal dispute. It was as if Clint was trying to warn them about something much larger, something that could change everything. Arthur took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. This was his courtroom, his domain. But even he couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease, the knowledge that something was unfolding right before his eyes, and he wasn't sure if he was prepared for it. "Mr. Eastwood," Judge Foster said slowly, his voice now measured, "if you are suggesting that there is a conspiracy or anything of the sort, then I expect you to present solid evidence. Otherwise, you'll find yourself in contempt of this court." Clint's expression remained unreadable. He didn't speak immediately, but when he did, his words were simple, but laced with a quiet warning. "Just remember, Your Honor, the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, and when it does, no one can control it." As Clint turned to leave, the room fell into an unsettling silence, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. Judge Foster remained seated, his fingers drumming on the desk, his mind racing. He knew that whatever Clint Eastwood was involved in, it was far more than just a simple distraction. The storm had just begun. The days that followed Clint Eastwood's unexpected confrontation in the courtroom were a blur for Judge Arthur Foster. The sense of unease that Clint's words had planted within him only grew stronger with each passing moment. Every decision Foster made felt like it was laced with doubt. Every ruling felt like a calculated move in a game he didn't fully understand. The tension was palpable in the courthouse. No one knew exactly what Clint had meant, but everyone could feel it. Something was coming. It wasn't just the usual drama of a high-profile case or the undercurrents of political pressure. This felt different, like the calm before a storm. Judge Foster sat at his desk, reviewing case files with meticulous precision, trying to drown out the growing nagging voice in his head. His office had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where he could escape the noise of the outside world, a place where his grip on control still felt intact. But even here, in the quiet of his chambers, the weight of Clint's cryptic words followed him. The truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, and when it does, no one can control it. Foster had seen his share of mysteries, of shady deals, and political games. But this was something different. Clint Eastwood wasn't just a celebrity. he was something far more elusive. The way he had carried himself that day in the courtroom spoke volumes. There was a quiet power about him, one that seemed to make everyone else around him feel small. It wasn't until the late hours of the evening when the phone rang, shattering the silence of his office. Foster hesitated for a moment before answering. "Judge Foster," he said, his voice still a bit hoarse from the stress of the past days. "Your Honor, this is Special Agent Carter with the FBI." The voice on the other end said, its tone urgent. "We need to speak with you about a matter of grave importance. I think you may already have some idea of what it concerns." Foster's blood ran cold. His grip tightened around the phone. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this was uncharted territory. "What is this about?" he asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I suggest we meet in person," Agent Carter replied. "There's something you need to know. Something big, and it involves Clint Eastwood." Foster felt a knot form in his stomach. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but this wasn't it. Clint Eastwood had been a loose cannon in the courtroom, but now it sounded like he was in the middle of something far deeper, something that reached into places Foster wasn't prepared to go. After a brief pause, Foster agreed. "I'll meet you in an hour. Tell me where." The drive to the FBI office felt like the longest of his life. Foster couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap, that something was waiting for him just beyond the door. The traffic outside seemed to move in slow motion, every light an agonizing pause, every minute dragging him closer to the unknown. When he finally arrived, the building loomed before him like a fortress, cold and unwelcoming. He entered the lobby, where Agent Carter was waiting, his expression hard and unreadable. Carter was a man used to handling dangerous situations, and his gaze was sharp, as if he were constantly assessing every detail around him. "Judge Foster, thank you for coming," Agent Carter said, leading him down a long hallway. "Please, follow me." The two men walked in silence, the heavy atmosphere thick between them. Foster felt the weight of his every step as they reached a secured conference room. Inside, the door closed behind them with a soft thud, locking them into a space that felt far too small for the gravity of what was about to be discussed. Agent Carter sat across from Foster and slid a thick file across the table, its contents sealed in a manila folder. "This is where things get complicated," he began, his voice low, careful. "We've been investigating a series of high-level corruption cases involving several key figures in law enforcement. But recently, we've learned that these figures are tied to something much bigger, something with national implications." Foster's eyes narrowed as he reached for the folder, opening it with careful hands. Inside were a series of photographs, documents, and records, each one more shocking than the last. He saw familiar faces, local officials, even a few high-ranking officers within the police department. But there was one name that stood out above the rest: Clint Eastwood. Foster's heart skipped a beat. "What does Clint have to do with this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Agent Carter's eyes met his, the weight of the truth settling into the air between them. "Clint Eastwood is no ordinary man, Judge. He's been working undercover with us for years. We've been monitoring a series of criminal organizations, and Clint has been at the center of it all. What you saw in that courtroom wasn't a stunt or a joke. It was a warning. He's been gathering intel, trying to expose a network of corruption that reaches deep into the heart of the city." Foster's mind raced as he processed the information. Clint Eastwood, the man who had walked into his courtroom with a badge and a warning, had been working with the FBI? All this time, the Hollywood icon was more than just an actor. He was a player in a game of national security. "But why didn't you tell me?" Foster demanded, his voice rising with disbelief. "Why all the secrecy?" Agent Carter leaned forward, his expression grave. "Because Clint wanted to keep things under the radar. He didn't want to blow his cover, and he didn't want anyone to know what was really going on. The fewer people who knew, the better. But now, the stakes are higher. The corruption goes deeper than we thought, and we need your help to bring it to light." Foster sat back, stunned, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. Everything had changed in an instant. The case he had thought was just another routine trial had become a part of something much larger, something dangerous. He was in this now, whether he wanted to be or not. The truth was out there, hidden beneath layers of lies and deceit, and Clint Eastwood was the only one who seemed to know how to uncover it. But what did it mean for Foster? Could he really help expose the darkness within the system he had sworn to protect? As the seconds ticked by, Foster realized that he had just crossed a line. There was no turning back now. The journey ahead would be full of danger, and he had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went. But one thing was certain. This was only the beginning. The next few days blurred into a whirlwind of action, deception, and adrenaline for Judge Arthur Foster. What had started as a routine legal case had now transformed into something he never could have anticipated. Every step he took seemed to be carefully orchestrated, as if he were a pawn in a much larger game. And yet, despite the pressure mounting on him, there was a nagging sense of something deeper, something that felt almost like fate, pulling him forward. Clint Eastwood's warnings haunted him. The words Clint had spoken in the courtroom, cryptic and ominous, felt like a warning he couldn't escape. There were moments when Foster wondered if it would have been easier to just dismiss Clint's concerns, to chalk it up to some kind of delusion or conspiracy theory. But deep down, he knew better. The FBI's revelation had shaken him to his core. Clint's involvement with a national covert operation had shattered the walls around Foster's sense of reality. It was a quiet evening when everything changed. Foster had been reviewing case files late into the night, the hum of his desk lamp the only sound in his office. His phone rang, the sudden intrusion sending a jolt of tension through his body. Without hesitation, he answered. "Foster," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of anxiety. "It's Carter," came the familiar voice on the other end of the line, urgent and strained. "We've got a problem. You need to meet me. Now." Foster's stomach twisted. "What happened?" "It's Clint. He's gone off the radar. We can't reach him. We think he might have been compromised." The words hit Foster like a punch to the gut. He had known Clint was playing a dangerous game. But this was something else. He quickly gathered his coat and rushed out the door, the cold night air doing little to calm the storm raging inside him. Every part of him screamed to move faster, to get to the truth before it was buried in the shadows. The drive to the rendezvous point felt like an eternity. The closer he got to the location, the more the sense of urgency grew. His mind raced through the possibilities. Had Clint been betrayed? Had the people he'd been working to expose finally found him? When Foster arrived, he was met by Agent Carter, who looked more haggard than usual, his expression dark. "It's worse than we thought," Carter said, leading Foster toward an unmarked van parked in the shadows. "We've traced Clint's last known location. He was meeting with someone from the inside, a high-ranking official tied to the corruption we've been tracking. But something went wrong. Clint hasn't been heard from since." Foster felt a surge of panic, but he swallowed it down. "Who was he meeting?" he asked, his voice steady despite the growing dread inside him. "We don't know," Carter replied, glancing down at the map in his hands. But the meeting took place at a location connected to some of the biggest players in the corruption network. If Clint was compromised, then we're all in danger. Foster's heart raced. The pieces were finally starting to come together, but the revelation was worse than he could have ever imagined. The people Clint had been working against were powerful, too powerful to go down easily. And now, Clint Eastwood was in their grasp. The air felt thick with tension as the two men drove to the location, a remote warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Every turn of the wheel brought them closer to the truth, but the closer they got, the more Foster realized just how much danger they were in. If Clint had been captured, they might be walking right into a trap. As they approached the warehouse, a feeling of dread washed over Foster. He could feel it in his bones, that something was waiting for them inside. It was a feeling he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. When they entered the warehouse, the sight that greeted them was nothing short of terrifying. Clint Eastwood was standing there, his back to them, surrounded by several men. But it wasn't the sight of Clint himself that took Foster's breath away. It was the look on his face. Clint's expression was unreadable, but there was a coldness in his eyes that sent a shiver down Foster's spine. The former actor, the once fearless icon, looked like a man who had seen the darkness and had been changed by it. He was no longer just Clint Eastwood, the movie star. He was Clint Eastwood, a man who had stepped into the shadows and emerged with scars that no one could see. "Clint," Foster called out, his voice hesitant, unsure of what to expect. Clint turned slowly, his eyes meeting Foster's. The moment their gazes locked, the weight of everything, the lies, the secrets, the danger, hit Foster like a freight train. He saw something in Clint's eyes, something that said, "I knew this would happen. I knew it would come to this." And it was in that moment that Foster understood. He wasn't just helping Clint. He was stepping into a war that had been raging for far longer than he could have imagined. "Get down," Clint barked suddenly, his voice sharp and commanding as gunfire erupted from the shadows. The men who had been surrounding Clint opened fire, the sound of bullets ricocheting off the walls filling the air. Foster barely had time to react before Clint was pushing him behind a stack of crates, shielding him with his body. "Stay low," Clint ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We need to move fast." Foster could feel the rush of adrenaline in his veins as the gunfire continued to rain down. His heart was pounding in his chest, but there was something else, something deep within him that said this was it, the moment that would define everything. They moved quickly, with Clint leading the way, his experience in these situations evident. It wasn't just about survival now. It was about exposing the truth. And for Clint, there was no turning back. As they reached the back exit, Clint looked at Foster, his expression hard. "You're in this now," Clint said, his words full of gravity. "There's no going back. The truth is out there, and it's uglier than you think." Foster nodded, his mind reeling with the realization that his life, everything he knew, had just been turned upside down. But there was no turning back now. He was in this fight, and there was no going back. The emotional weight of the situation hit him like a freight train. Everything had led to this moment. The truth, the danger, the fear. It was all coming to a head. And no matter how much he wanted to walk away, there was no choice but to keep moving forward. Clint Eastwood had dragged him into the depths of a conspiracy that threatened to unravel everything. And as they made their way to safety, Foster realized that the real journey was just beginning. The hours following the gunfight at the warehouse were a blur. Clint Eastwood and Judge Arthur Foster had barely escaped the bullets, with only their instincts and the chaos around them keeping them alive. As they made their way to a secluded safe house, the weight of what had happened slowly began to sink in. Clint didn't say much as they drove, his eyes scanning the road ahead with the sharpness of someone who had lived through countless close calls. Foster sat in the passenger seat, his mind racing as he tried to process the night's events. The world he had known, his life as a judge, the carefully structured system he had worked within, had been shattered. In its place, an unfamiliar reality had emerged, one filled with danger, corruption, and the undeniable truth that Clint Eastwood was no ordinary man. When they finally arrived at the safe house, Clint motioned for Foster to follow him inside. The building was small but well hidden, nestled among dense trees in a quiet part of town. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them off the radar for now. Inside, Clint wasted no time. He moved with purpose, grabbing a duffel bag from the corner of the room and pulling out a laptop. He began typing furiously, as if every second counted. Foster watched him for a moment, still trying to shake the adrenaline that was coursing through his veins. "So," Foster said, breaking the silence, "what now? What happens next?" Clint looked up at him, his face drawn but determined. "Now we wait. We need to make sure we're off the grid for a while, let the heat die down." He paused for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. "You're in this deeper than you thought, Foster. And there's no going back now." Foster sat down at the small kitchen table, his mind spinning. The truth Clint had been fighting for was bigger than either of them could have imagined. It wasn't just about corruption. It was about power, about the forces that manipulated the system from the shadows. And now, Foster was a part of it. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He had been pulled into something much larger, something that he wasn't sure he was prepared to handle. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Foster asked, his voice carrying the weight of his frustration and confusion. "Why didn't you warn me about how dangerous this was? Why keep me in the dark?" Clint didn't answer right away. He seemed to weigh the question carefully before finally responding. Because I didn't want to drag you into this. You're a judge, Foster. You've got a reputation, a career. I didn't want to destroy that. But it's too late for that now. You're in the fight whether you like it or not. And I don't regret pulling you in. You're stronger than you think. Foster wasn't sure if he felt reassured or more overwhelmed. But there was something about Clint's words, about the quiet confidence he exuded, that struck a chord with him. Maybe it was the way Clint had kept his cool in the face of danger, or the way he had always managed to stay one step ahead of the people trying to destroy him. There was a depth to Clint that Foster had never truly understood until now. For the first time in days, Foster let out a deep breath. The weight of the situation didn't feel as crushing as it had before. It still weighed heavily on him, but it was no longer unbearable. The events had changed him, but they had also forced him to confront something he had been avoiding, his own sense of purpose. I don't know if I'm ready for this, Foster admitted, his voice quiet. I've spent my life in the courtroom, making judgments. But this is something else entirely. Clint nodded, understanding the hesitation. It's not about being ready, he said simply. It's about doing what's right when everything else falls apart. That's what we've got left, Foster. Just doing what's right. Foster looked at Clint, his eyes searching the older man's face for any sign of doubt or hesitation. But there was none. Clint was resolute, unshaken by everything that had happened. In that moment, Foster realized that he had been given a rare chance, one that few people ever received. He had been given the opportunity to make a real difference, to stand up against forces much larger than himself. But it wouldn't be easy. As the hours passed and the night stretched on, Foster found himself reflecting on everything that had led him here. He thought back to the case that had started it all, the courtroom, the strange encounter with Clint, the cryptic warnings. He thought about the people whose lives had been ruined by the corruption Clint had exposed, and the ones who were still suffering in silence. This wasn't just about Clint anymore. This was about something bigger, something that affected the lives of every person in the city, in the country. The corruption was deep, and it wasn't going to be easy to root it out. But Foster had made up his mind. He wasn't going to turn away. Clint glanced over at him, as if sensing the shift in Foster's resolve. You're not in this alone, Foster. We've got a long road ahead of us, but we'll get there, one step at a time. For the first time since the chaos had begun, Foster allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, and the dangers were far from over. But as long as Clint Eastwood was by his side, he knew they had a fighting chance. With that thought, Foster stood up from the table, a newfound sense of determination settling in his chest. It was time to take action. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. The following days felt like a blur, a chaotic whirlwind of shifting alliances and unforeseen threats. After their narrow escape from the warehouse, Clint and Foster had settled into the safe house, lying low, constantly on edge. But they knew the calm wouldn't last. The storm was coming, and it would be far more dangerous than they could have anticipated. Foster spent most of his time studying the information Clint had gathered, the pieces of the puzzle that slowly began to make sense. There were patterns in the corruption, ties between powerful individuals, politicians, business moguls, even members of the law enforcement and judiciary systems that went back decades. The more he looked, the more everything seemed connected. The strings of the conspiracy were vast, and the deeper they went, the more deadly it became. Clint, for his part, was taking the whole situation in stride. He never seemed rattled, never flinched in the face of danger. But Foster could see the strain in his eyes, the exhaustion that came from years of fighting an invisible war. There was more to Clint's calm than just experience. The man had seen horrors that would break most people, and yet, he kept fighting. Still, even Clint couldn't prepare Foster for what was about to come. One evening, as the two men sat at the kitchen table, a sudden knock at the door broke the silence. Foster's heart skipped a beat, the familiar tension creeping back into his bones. It was too soon. They couldn't have been found already. They'd been careful, staying off the radar. Clint stood up immediately, signaling for Foster to stay quiet. He moved toward the door, his steps deliberate, each one echoing like a drumbeat in Foster's chest. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a muffled voice. "It's me." Open up. Clint's face hardened. It was a voice he recognized. He threw open the door, and in stepped Agent Carter, his expression grim. Behind him stood two men in dark suits, their faces unreadable. They were silent, their presence almost suffocating as they surveyed the room. "What's going on, Carter?" Clint asked, his voice measured but tight. "You said we had time. We were supposed to stay off the radar." Carter stepped inside, motioning for the two men to wait outside. He closed the door behind him, his eyes darting nervously toward Foster, then back to Clint. "We don't have time," Carter said quietly. "The network is getting smarter. They're closing in. We've been compromised." Foster stood up, his heart racing. "What does that mean? Who's compromised? What's going on?" Carter turned to him, his face drawn with worry. "It means they're onto us. We thought we had a mole inside their operation, someone who could give us intel, but they've turned the tables on us. We've lost contact with the inside source. Whoever is pulling the strings knows exactly what we're doing. They know about the safe house. They know about you, Foster." Foster felt the blood drain from his face. He had hoped to stay out of the line of fire, to remain on the periphery of this dangerous game. But now, he was thrust back into the heart of the storm. Clint's gaze didn't waver. "How bad is it?" he asked, his voice low. "Bad," Carter replied. "Very bad. We've got operatives in the field trying to track down the leak, but it's only a matter of time before they find us." The two men exchanged a look, and it was clear that they both understood the gravity of the situation. The conspiracy they were fighting against wasn't just a series of isolated incidents. It was a well-oiled machine that had infiltrated every corner of the system. And now, they were part of it. Clint turned to Foster, his eyes narrowing. "We need to move. Now." Foster's mind raced, but he didn't argue. He had no choice. The walls were closing in, and if they didn't act fast, they'd be trapped. "What's the plan?" Foster asked, his voice steady despite the chaos inside his mind. Carter spoke up. "We've got a location, an off-the-books facility outside the city. It's one of the few places we can go that they won't have eyes on. We need to move now." Clint nodded. "Get the gear. We leave in 5. The urgency in his voice left no room for discussion. Foster's heart pounded in his chest as he grabbed his jacket and followed Clint out of the safe house. The streets outside were dark, the silence of the night only broken by the sound of their hurried footsteps. They moved swiftly, blending into the shadows, as if the very act of moving quickly would somehow keep them out of sight. As they made their way to the car, Foster couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His mind raced with questions. Who had betrayed them? Was it someone inside the FBI, someone they trusted? Or had the conspiracy's reach extended further than they had realized? And why hadn't they been more careful? Clint's sharp gaze flicked toward him, as if sensing his thoughts. "We don't have answers yet, Foster. We'll get there. But right now, we need to focus on getting out of here." Foster nodded, trying to push his doubts aside. They had no time for uncertainty. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than ever. As they drove toward the facility, the tension in the air thickened. The quiet hum of the engine felt oppressive, as though it was carrying the weight of everything that had happened. And yet, there was something else in the air, something that Foster couldn't quite identify. It was a sense of impending danger, a feeling that the world as they knew it was about to shatter completely. When they arrived at the facility, it was clear they were far from safe. The building loomed in front of them, dark and foreboding. But there was no turning back. The conspiracy was closing in, and Clint and Foster were running out of time. "Ready?" Clint asked, his voice steady as always, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. Foster swallowed hard, his mind racing with the enormity of what they were up against. But one thing was certain, he wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. "Let's go," Foster said, his voice filled with resolve. And with that, they stepped into the darkness, fully aware that the war they had joined was far from over. The fight was only just beginning. The facility was a fortress of silence, nestled deep in the outskirts of the city. Its walls were tall and weathered, designed to keep out anyone who didn't belong. But as Clint and Foster approached, there was no comfort in the isolation. They knew they weren't truly safe, not yet. They had to be vigilant, eyes in the shadows, ears on the walls. Inside, the atmosphere was sterile, cold, and unforgiving. Fluorescent lights hummed above them as they were ushered into a small operations room by Agent Carter. The room was filled with monitors displaying a maze of satellite feeds, surveillance footage, and encrypted communications. It looked like the kind of place where secrets were kept and plans were made. But Clint had learned long ago that nothing was ever truly safe. "What now?" Foster asked, his voice edged with caution as he glanced around the room, scanning the faces of the agents standing guard. Carter hesitated for a moment before responding. "Now we regroup. We've got a few hours before the next phase of the operation kicks off. We need to stay low until then." Foster nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a sense of unease in the air, a tension that was almost palpable. His gut told him that there was more going on here than just a simple regrouping. He didn't trust the silence, didn't trust the way everyone was acting so calm, as if the world wasn't on the brink of unraveling. Clint, however, seemed unfazed. He was studying the monitors, his eyes moving across the screen with a sharp focus. Foster knew better than to question Clint's instincts, but even he couldn't deny the heavy weight in the room. After what felt like hours, the door opened, and two men walked in, both wearing suits and carrying the air of authority. One of them was unfamiliar to Foster, but the other, he recognized instantly. It was John Hargrove, the FBI agent who had been working with Clint for years. Foster had always trusted him. Hargrove was the type of guy who had a sense of loyalty that couldn't be questioned. Or so he thought. "Clint," Hargrove said, his voice smooth but strained. "We need to talk. Alone." Clint gave a slight nod and stood, motioning for Foster to stay put. The look in Clint's eyes was unreadable, but Foster felt a flicker of unease stir in his chest. As Clint stepped into the hallway with Hargrove, Foster's eyes followed them, his thoughts a whirlwind of suspicion and uncertainty. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. Foster's impatience began to grow. What was taking them so long? It wasn't like Clint to spend this much time in private conversation, especially with Hargrove. Something felt off. And then, suddenly, a noise came from down the hall, a muffled shout, followed by a loud crash. Foster sprang to his feet, his heart hammering in his chest. He wasn't sure what was happening, but the urgency in the sound was unmistakable. Without thinking, Foster rushed down the hallway, his steps quick and purposeful. He reached the corner and turned, only to stop dead in his tracks. There, in the dim light of the hallway, stood Clint. His back was pressed against the wall, eyes locked on Hargrove, who was holding a gun. But it wasn't just any gun. It was a sleek, high-powered rifle, the kind Clint had seen in the hands of enemies far more dangerous than Hargrove ever appeared to be. "Clint!" Foster shouted, taking a step forward. Hargrove's eyes flicked toward him, a cold smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "You should have known, Foster," he said, his voice dripping with a venomous calm. "You thought you could trust me, thought I was on your side. But you were wrong." Foster's mind raced, his thoughts struggling to keep up with the rapidly shifting situation. "What the hell is going on, Hargrove?" he demanded, his voice tight with disbelief. Clint didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply stared at Hargrove, his expression cold, unreadable. There was something in Clint's eyes now, something like recognition, like he knew the truth all along, but had been waiting for the right moment to reveal it. "You set us up," Clint said quietly, his voice low but filled with conviction. Hargrove chuckled darkly, the sound echoing in the narrow hallway. "I didn't just set you up, Clint. I've been running the show from the beginning." Foster took a step back, his mind spinning. The words didn't make sense. They couldn't. Hargrove had been a friend, a trusted ally. How could he be the one behind all of this? "Why?" Foster asked, his voice shaking with the realization that the man he had trusted had never been what he seemed. "Why betray us? Why now?" Hargrove took a slow step forward, his gun still trained on Clint. "Because you're both too dangerous," he said, his eyes cold as ice. "You've gotten too close to the truth, and that's something we can't allow. I've been working with them, the ones pulling the strings. And now it's time for you to disappear. Foster's world tilted on its axis. The web of lies and deception had grown even more tangled, and he had been blind to it all. The betrayal was not just personal. It was professional, a devastating blow to everything he had worked for. Clint remained calm, his eyes never leaving Hargrove's. "You made a mistake," Clint said, his voice like steel. "You've underestimated us." For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The tension in the hallway was thick, the air heavy with the weight of impending violence. Foster wasn't sure how this would end, but he knew one thing for certain. This betrayal would change everything. And then, as if the world itself had shifted, Clint made his move. In an instant, he had disarmed Hargrove, knocking the gun from his hands and pinning him against the wall. "Clint, wait!" Foster shouted, his heart racing as he realized what was happening. Clint's face was a mask of cold determination, his eyes steely as he looked at Hargrove. "You're not worth my time," he said, before he turned to Foster. "Get the backup. Now." Foster didn't hesitate. He turned and ran down the hallway, his mind a blur as he sprinted toward the facility's communications room. It was a race against time. He didn't know how this would play out, but one thing was certain. The game had changed. The stakes were higher than ever, and now they had a traitor to deal with. By the time he returned, Clint had already secured Hargrove. But the betrayal still hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The trust they had placed in Hargrove was gone, replaced by a deep sense of loss and betrayal. As Clint and Foster stood together, their eyes locked, they both knew one thing. They were on their own now. There was no turning back. The conspiracy they were fighting was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined, and they had no choice but to keep fighting. The battle was far from over, and with every step, they were getting closer to the heart of it. But the truth, as they would soon learn, came at a cost. The hours after Hargrove's betrayal felt like a fog, a haze that clouded everything Clint and Foster had worked for. The room was silent, heavy with the unspoken words and the weight of what had just transpired. Their trust had been shattered in an instant, and the walls that had once seemed secure now felt more like prisons. Every corner, every shadow, held a threat. The game had changed, and Clint knew they needed to move fast if they were going to survive. Clint leaned against the wall, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the surface as he mulled over their next steps. He was a man of action, not one to sit idly and stew in uncertainty. But this time, the situation was different. This wasn't just about getting away from a few rogue agents or bad guys. Hargrove's betrayal had exposed a much larger conspiracy, one that reached higher and deeper than either of them had ever imagined. "We need to make our move," Clint said finally, breaking the silence. Foster had been sitting across from him, his eyes scanning the monitors in front of him, but he hadn't been able to focus on anything. The sting of betrayal still lingered in his mind, clouding his judgment. "What's the plan?" he asked, his voice flat, resigned. He wasn't sure what Clint had in mind, but the pressure was building, and they had no time to waste. Clint's expression hardened. "We need to get out of here. This facility is compromised. We've been compromised. We don't know how much time we have before they move in and lock everything down." Foster stood, his mind already whirring with possibilities. "But we don't have a clear way out. They'll be waiting for us at every exit, every road. We're trapped." Clint's gaze flicked to the screen, where a map of the facility and surrounding area was displayed. "Not if we take an unexpected route. They'll be expecting us to go out the front door, the way we came in. But that's not our way out. There's a network of old service tunnels beneath this place. If we can get to them, we can slip out undetected." Foster raised an eyebrow. "Old service tunnels? That sounds like something straight out of a spy movie." Clint gave him a dry smile. Sometimes the old-school methods work best. Foster wasn't sure he entirely trusted the plan, but at this point, they didn't have a choice. They had to act fast, before they were trapped with nowhere to go. "All right, Clint. Let's do it." Clint motioned to the team of agents that had been working with them. "Gather your gear. We're moving out." The agents quickly moved into action, gathering supplies and preparing for the escape. Clint and Foster moved through the facility's hallways, their steps purposeful but careful. Every door, every hallway, was an obstacle, a potential trap waiting to be sprung. But Clint had a sixth sense when it came to danger, and he guided them through the labyrinth with uncanny precision. The further they moved from the central command room, the more on edge Foster felt. Every creak of the floor, every distant sound, made his heart race. "Keep your eyes open," Clint muttered under his breath. "They could be anywhere." Foster nodded, his mind racing through every possibility. What if they were walking straight into an ambush? What if someone had already anticipated their move? There were so many questions, so many unknowns, but for the first time in a long while, Foster realized that the stakes had never been higher. There was no going back. They reached a nondescript door at the end of the hallway. Clint paused, checking the surroundings, then motioned for everyone to stay silent. He pulled a small device from his pocket and inserted it into a panel next to the door. A soft beep echoed through the corridor, followed by the sound of the door unlocking. The tunnel beneath the facility was narrow, low-ceilinged, and damp. The air felt thick with dust, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. It was a far cry from the clean, sterile environment of the facility above, but it offered them the element of surprise, something they desperately needed. Clint led the way, his movements fluid and practiced. He had used these tunnels before, years ago, when the stakes had been just as high. Foster followed closely behind, his senses on high alert. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the walls as they made their way through the dark, narrow passage. The tunnel seemed endless, stretching on for what felt like miles. But Clint didn't slow down, and Foster kept pace, pushing aside the fear gnawing at him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached a metal door at the end of the tunnel. Clint didn't hesitate. He turned the handle, and they stepped into the night air. It was quiet outside. The city spread out before them like a sprawling maze of lights and shadows. For a moment, they stood there, taking in the vastness of the world beyond the facility. It was both exhilarating and terrifying to realize that they were free, for now. But freedom was fleeting. They weren't out of danger yet. "We're not safe yet," Clint said, his voice low. "This is just the beginning. We need to get to a secure location." Foster nodded, his mind already running through the possibilities. Where could they go? Who could they trust now? The question that kept running through his mind was whether there were any allies left, or if they were truly alone in this fight. They moved quickly, ducking into the shadows as they made their way toward the nearest safe house. Their exit from the facility had been smooth, but Clint knew that wouldn't last. The conspiracy they were up against had eyes everywhere. They couldn't afford to let their guard down, not even for a moment. As they reached a secluded alleyway, Clint stopped and turned to Foster. "We need to figure out our next move. The people who betrayed us are already on the move. We need information. We need to know who's pulling the strings." Foster felt the weight of the moment. There was no going back. The betrayal had stripped away the last of their security. Now, they were fighting for survival, against forces far bigger and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. And yet, despite the odds, Foster felt a flicker of hope. They had escaped, this time, and as long as they were alive, there was still a chance. A chance to fight back, a chance to expose the truth. "We'll find a way," Foster said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "We have to." Clint met his gaze, a faint glimmer of something like approval in his eyes. "We will. But it won't be easy. The real fight starts now." As they disappeared into the night, the weight of the battle ahead settled on their shoulders. The conspiracy was vast, its reach beyond anything they had anticipated. But Clint and Foster were in this together, and as long as they were breathing, they weren't going down without a fight. The night felt suffocating, an oppressive blanket of darkness that seemed to swallow everything around Clint and Foster as they made their way through the winding streets. The air was thick with the tension that had been building ever since the betrayal. Every step felt like it could be their last, and though they had escaped the immediate danger, they knew they couldn't outrun their enemies for long. They had just scratched the surface of a conspiracy that stretched far beyond anything they had imagined. As they approached the safe house, a small, nondescript building on the edge of town, Clint's instincts were on edge. There was something wrong about the place, something off about the way the shadows clung to the alleyway. He couldn't put his finger on it, but it was as if the walls themselves were watching them. Foster noticed Clint's unease. "What is it?" he asked quietly, keeping his voice low in the stillness of the night. Clint didn't answer right away. His eyes darted from side to side, scanning the surroundings. "I don't know," he muttered, "but I don't like this." They slowed their pace, stepping lightly as they approached the door. Clint checked the locks before giving it a quick, but firm, twist. It opened with a creak, and the two of them slipped inside. The safe house was dimly lit, the air musty from disuse. The only furniture was a few chairs, a table, and a desk covered in papers. It looked like the kind of place where people went when they needed to hide, but the lack of any personal touches made it feel cold, abandoned. Foster glanced around but didn't speak. They were still on high alert, too aware of the danger to relax. Clint went straight to the desk, sifting through the papers. "We need intel," he muttered, flipping through files, looking for anything that could give them a lead. "We need to know who's behind this. Hargrove's not the only one." Foster stood by the door, his hand resting on the handle as he kept watch. He could feel his pulse quicken, a sense of impending doom gnawing at him. The longer they stayed in this place, the more it felt like a trap. A safe house should have felt like a refuge, but it felt like a tomb instead. Clint's voice broke the silence. "Here," he said, pulling out a file marked with a symbol they both recognized, the insignia of a high-level government agency. It wasn't one that they had ever been officially briefed on, but its meaning was unmistakable. "What is this?" Foster asked, leaning over to get a better look at the document Clint was holding. His eyes widened as he read the contents. This can't be right. These names, this list." Clint's jaw tightened as he skimmed through the pages. "It's a list of high-ranking officials, people we thought were on our side. But it's more than that. It's a network, a conspiracy that's been pulling strings at the highest levels for years." Foster felt a chill run down his spine. The implications were staggering. The people they trusted, the people who had been feeding them information, were all part of this web. "We're not just dealing with rogue agents, are we? This goes all the way to the top." Clint didn't answer right away. He was already flipping through more documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. "We're dealing with something much bigger than that. Something that goes beyond anything we've seen. Whoever's behind this is operating in the shadows, pulling the strings without anyone noticing." Foster paced the room, trying to process the information. His mind was racing with questions, too many questions that didn't have answers. The people they thought they could rely on were part of the enemy, and if they were to survive, they would have to navigate a labyrinth of lies and deception. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside, drawing Clint's attention. He motioned for Foster to stay silent, and they both pressed themselves against the wall, waiting. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Clint's hand moved to the sidearm holstered at his waist, his grip tight. Foster instinctively followed his lead, his own hand hovering near his weapon. It was a reflex, an instinct that had been honed over years of danger. They weren't alone anymore. The door creaked open slowly, and a shadowy figure stepped inside. But it wasn't one of the agents they had been expecting. It was a woman, tall and lean, dressed in all black. Her face was partially obscured by a hood, but her eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto Clint's immediately. "Don't move," the woman said, her voice low and controlled. "I'm not here to hurt you." Clint didn't lower his weapon. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady but filled with suspicion. The woman's lips curved into a faint smile, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Let's just say I'm someone who's been watching this whole thing unfold. And right now, you need to listen to me if you want to stay alive." Foster shifted, but Clint held up a hand to stop him. He wasn't sure if he could trust her, but there was something about the way she spoke, calm, collected, that told him she was no ordinary person. "I'm Agent Sophia Black," she continued, stepping further into the room, "and I have information that will help you. But first, we need to get out of here." Clint's eyes narrowed. "Why should we trust you?" Sophia didn't flinch. "Because the enemy you're fighting is bigger than you think, and they've already started hunting you. If you stay here much longer, you won't make it out alive." Foster exchanged a look with Clint, and Clint gave him a barely perceptible nod. It wasn't the time to debate trust. The clock was ticking, and every moment they spent in the safe house only brought them closer to the unknown enemies closing in on them. "Where's your escape route?" Clint asked, lowering his weapon but still keeping a wary eye on her. Sophia didn't hesitate. "Follow me. And keep quiet. We're not out of the woods yet." As they moved through the shadows, the weight of her words settled over them. There were enemies watching them from the darkness, but even worse, they didn't know where the true danger was coming from. The real enemy was still unseen, hiding in the depths of the conspiracy, pulling the strings from the shadows. But Clint and Foster knew one thing. They couldn't afford to be passive anymore. The fight was far from over, and if they were going to survive, they would have to face it head-on, no matter how dangerous it might be. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The narrow alleyway stretched before them like a dark tunnel, but the light at the end seemed too far to reach. The weight of the night, of everything that had happened, pressed heavily on Clint's shoulders. The air was thick, humid with tension, and the footsteps behind them only made the quiet feel more oppressive. He wasn't sure what to make of Sophia Black. Her sudden appearance had caught them off guard, and though her warnings were dire, there was something in her eyes that Clint couldn't fully read. They moved in silence, not speaking unless necessary. Foster kept close, his mind racing, and Clint could sense his unease. They were on edge, and rightly so. The world they had once known was slipping away, replaced by shadows and whispers of a conspiracy far too large for them to face alone. But now, they had Sophia, or at least, they had her for the moment. And with her, a new, uncertain path. Clint stole a glance at Sophia as she led them down yet another nondescript alley. She walked with the confidence of someone who had been in dangerous situations more times than she could count. But there was something else, something in the way she held herself that made Clint suspicious. She was more than just an agent. She was a survivor, too. "Where are we going?" Foster finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You can't expect us to just trust you after everything that's happened." Sophia didn't slow her pace, her eyes scanning the area around them, as though searching for any sign of movement. "You don't have to trust me, but you'll need my help if you want to survive." Clint exchanged a glance with Foster. They had no choice but to follow for now. If they stayed here too long, they'd be sitting ducks. And from the look of it, Sophia had a plan, whether they liked it or not. As they moved deeper into the city, Clint couldn't help but feel the weight of their situation. They were caught in a game they hadn't signed up for, with enemies on all sides and no clear path out. Trust had become a luxury they could no longer afford. The people who were supposed to protect them had turned on them. The ones they thought they could rely on had either disappeared or betrayed them. Sophia was the only one left with any answers. But was she truly an ally, or just another piece of the puzzle? They arrived at an old warehouse near the docks, its steel frame weathered and rusted. The windows were dark, the building abandoned. A perfect place to lay low, if only temporarily. Sophia led them to the back entrance, where she quickly swiped a card and punched in a code. The door creaked open, and she ushered them inside. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and metal. The warehouse was sparse, filled only with crates and dust-covered equipment. It was the kind of place no one would bother to look twice at, a safe house of sorts. "Get comfortable," Sophia said, shutting the door behind them. "We'll be here for a while." Clint remained standing by the door, his hand still on his gun, his eyes darting around the room. Foster went to the makeshift table in the corner, where papers and documents were scattered about. It seemed like Sophia had been here for some time, preparing for something she hadn't yet shared with them. "All right," Clint said, breaking the silence. "You've brought us here, but now it's time to explain. Who's pulling the strings? Who's behind all of this?" Sophia met his gaze, her face unreadable. "I'm not sure I can give you all the answers right away. But what I can tell you is this. You're not just fighting a few rogue agents. This goes higher, way higher, than you think." Foster looked up from the papers, his brow furrowed. "How high are we talking? Government? Intelligence agencies?" Sophia shook her head slowly. Think bigger. Clint's mind raced as he tried to process her words. What do you mean, bigger? You're saying this is some sort of global operation? Sophia's eyes narrowed. I'm saying there are forces out there that you won't even be able to recognize. Governments, corporations, factions within the intelligence community. They've been playing this game for decades, and now they've set their sights on you. On all of us. Foster stood, his hands clenched into fists. And you're a part of this? You've been working with these people? Sophia's gaze hardened. I was part of a different operation, a different objective, but I realized too late what was really going on. By then, it was too late to walk away. I don't expect you to trust me, but I'm not your enemy. Clint stepped forward, his voice low but full of intensity. You don't get to tell us what to do. We've been betrayed by our own people. Every time we think we're one step ahead, it turns out someone's been playing us. So no, we don't trust you, not yet. Sophia held his gaze without flinching. She wasn't intimidated by Clint's words, nor did she try to explain herself further. Fair enough. But you don't have time to argue. You need answers, and I have them. But it's not going to be easy. The people after you are already hunting you down. If you don't want to end up dead, you need to stay focused. Clint knew she was right. As much as he wanted to argue, to demand more answers, the clock was ticking. They couldn't afford to waste time. Every moment they spent debating was another moment they could be getting closer to danger. He glanced at Foster, who gave him a reluctant nod. All right, Clint said, his tone begrudging. We'll work together for now. But don't expect us to trust you just because you say so. Sophia's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. I never asked for your trust, just your cooperation. The tension in the room thickened, but there was no time for further confrontation. The real work was just beginning. As they gathered around the table, Sophia began to spread out more documents. Clint's eyes flicked over them quickly. Notes, maps, names. They were all interconnected, pieces of a larger puzzle. But what struck him most was the sheer scale of it all. This wasn't just a conspiracy of a few bad actors. This was something far more insidious, with its roots embedded in the very institutions that were supposed to protect the public. This is only the beginning, Sophia said, pointing to a few key names and locations on the map. The people who've been manipulating events aren't finished with you yet. They'll come for you again. And when they do, you need to be ready. Foster leaned in, his voice tight with frustration. Ready for what? To keep running? To keep hiding? Sophia's gaze flicked over to Clint, then back to Foster. No. Ready to fight back. The words hung in the air, a challenge neither Clint nor Foster could ignore. The fight was far from over, and now they had a bitter ally to help them navigate the storm ahead. But every step forward came with a cost. And trust? Trust would be the hardest thing to build. The next few days felt like they were trapped in a nightmare, each moment more suffocating than the last. They couldn't escape the feeling that they were being watched. Every alleyway, every dark corner, every flicker of movement seemed to be a threat. The world around them had shifted, and they were no longer the hunters. They had become the hunted. Sophia had brought them to another safe house, a small apartment hidden in the city's maze of streets. It was far from comfortable, but it was secure, for now. The tension between Clint and Sophia hadn't eased, and every word was measured, each glance calculated. They weren't friends, but they were forced to work together, at least for the time being. Foster, ever the skeptic, kept his distance, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, always on guard. Clint paced the room, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. The conspiracy they had uncovered was vast, stretching across the highest levels of government, intelligence agencies, and corporations. There were names, faces, and locations scattered across the documents Sophia had shared with them. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, but no matter how hard he tried to put them together, the bigger picture eluded him. Any progress? Foster's voice broke through his thoughts. He was standing by the small table, his brow furrowed as he sifted through yet another stack of papers. Clint stopped pacing and turned to look at him. Not much. Every lead we follow seems to take us in circles. We can't get close to the heart of this without exposing ourselves. Whoever's behind this is watching our every move. Sophia, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. They're not just watching. They're waiting for you to make a mistake. Clint's eyes locked onto hers. And how do you know that? Sophia didn't flinch. Because I've been there. I've seen how they operate. They make you think you're in control, that you're the one pulling the strings. But in reality, you're just another pawn in their game. Foster scoffed. Great. So we're stuck in their trap, and we have no way out? Sophia's expression softened, just slightly. There is a way out, but it won't be easy. They're already tightening the noose around you. But there's a crack, an opening. If we can get to it, we might be able to take them down from the inside. Clint raised an eyebrow. And what makes you think you can get us out of this alive? Sophia paused, her gaze intense. Because I've seen how they think. I've been on the inside. I know what they're capable of. They won't expect us to strike back. Clint didn't respond right away. His mind was racing with the implications of what she was saying. Strike back? Against an enemy this powerful? It felt like an impossible mission, like trying to take down a fortress with nothing but a handful of soldiers and a broken plan. But what choice did they have? They couldn't keep running forever. All right, Clint said finally, his voice steady. We take the fight to them, but we do it smart. We can't afford to make mistakes. Sophia nodded, her lips curling into a thin smile. I'm glad to hear you're ready to fight, but we need more than just courage. We need information, and that's where you come in. Clint's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? You've already been inside their operation, Sophia said, her voice low and calculated. You've seen the structure, the way they move. You've been in the field. You know how to gather intel, how to expose the enemy. It's your turn to use what you know. Foster let out a low whistle. So now we're supposed to take down an entire network with just a few scraps of paper and some old intel? Sophia didn't seem bothered by his skepticism. You have more than that. You have experience, and you have a network of people who trust you. You just need to know where to look and when. Clint looked at Foster, who gave him a resigned nod. He knew what this meant. They were already in too deep to back out. The web had tightened around them, and they had no choice but to break it or be crushed under it. We'll need to find out where they're vulnerable, Clint said, more to himself than anyone else. We start small, take out their lower-tier operatives, disrupt their operations, create chaos. Make them think we're still fumbling around in the dark. Sophia's gaze flicked to him. Exactly. If we create enough confusion, we can draw them out. And when they make a mistake, we'll strike. The plan wasn't perfect, but it was the best option they had. They didn't have the luxury of time, and every moment they spent debating was a moment closer to their enemies closing in. As they began to strategize, Clint's mind kept returning to the one question that had been haunting him since they had uncovered the conspiracy. Who was the mastermind behind all of this? It was clear that they weren't just fighting rogue agents. They were fighting a machine. A network that spanned governments, corporations, and powerful individuals. But somewhere, hidden within the web, was a person pulling the strings. A mastermind who had orchestrated this entire operation. Sophia seemed to read his mind. You're wondering who's at the top, who's pulling the strings. I can't give you a name right now, but I will. We just need more time. Clint didn't trust her fully, not yet, but he couldn't afford to let that stop him. They needed to act fast, before their enemies had a chance to regroup. The next few hours were spent gathering what little intel they could. Sophia had connections, people she had worked with in the past, people who owed her favors. Some were willing to help, others weren't. But every piece of information they gathered brought them one step closer to the heart of the conspiracy. As night fell and they moved to their next location, the reality of their situation hit home. There was no turning back. They were deep in enemy territory, and every move they made had to be calculated. One wrong step, one slip-up, and it could all come crashing down. The web had tightened, but Clint wasn't ready to be its prey. Not yet. The air was thick with anticipation as Clint, Foster, and Sophia gathered in the small, dimly lit room. A single map covered the table in front of them, scattered with pins and scribbles, marking locations, operations, and people. It felt like they were preparing for war, because in many ways, they were. The conspiracy they were up against was massive, far-reaching, and while they had made some headway, They still didn't have all the pieces. But they had to start somewhere. No more waiting. No more playing defense. Clint ran his fingers through his hair, glancing at the clock on the wall. Every minute that passed felt like another chance for the enemy to catch up with them. He knew their first strike needed to be calculated, quick, precise, and low profile. They had no time to waste on flashy moves. Sophia was leaning over the map, marking an X at a location in the city. "This is where we'll hit first," she said, her voice steady and cool. "There's an underground facility here, linked to the operation. They're storing intel, sensitive files, things we need. But more importantly, they'll be expecting an attack sooner or later. This is a place they think is untouchable." Foster stood next to the map, scrutinizing it. "So, we take it out, quietly, and get what we need without alerting them." Sophia nodded. "Exactly. If we can disrupt this facility, it'll send a message. We're not just sitting around waiting for them to make the first move." Clint folded his arms across his chest, his mind already working through the logistics. "You've been there before?" Sophia's gaze was sharp. "I have. It's guarded, heavily. But the good news is, they're not expecting a direct assault. We'll get in through the maintenance tunnels, avoid the main entrances, and hit them from below." Foster wasn't convinced. "And you're sure about this? You're sure we can pull it off without getting caught?" Sophia didn't hesitate. "We have no choice. If we hesitate, if we play it safe, we lose. They'll close in on us, and we'll be dead before we even get the chance to retaliate." Clint didn't have time to argue. He knew she was right. There was no turning back. They had to act fast, and they had to act smart. The plan was set. They would infiltrate the underground facility, extract whatever intel they could, and disrupt the operation. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was their only shot. Every hour they spent preparing brought them closer to the inevitable. Either they succeeded, or they were finished. The night was quiet as they approached the target. The facility was situated on the outskirts of the city, hidden in plain sight, nestled within a network of industrial buildings. The area was dark, the streets eerily empty, as though the city itself had fallen asleep. Clint, Foster, and Sophia moved swiftly through the shadows, their steps silent on the cold pavement. Sophia led the way, her movements precise, almost instinctual. Clint couldn't help but admire her calm demeanor, despite the gravity of the situation. She had done this before, more times than she cared to count. Foster, on the other hand, was on edge, constantly checking over his shoulder, scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. They reached the entrance of the maintenance tunnels without incident. Sophia crouched by the entrance, quickly bypassing the security system with a small device from her bag. The door creaked open, revealing the dark, narrow passage beyond. "Here goes nothing," Sophia muttered, stepping inside. The tunnels were claustrophobic and damp, the walls lined with pipes and wires that seemed to stretch on forever. Clint followed closely behind, his senses heightened, every creak and whisper in the darkness making him jump. Foster brought up the rear, keeping his eyes peeled for any movement. They moved deeper into the facility, their footsteps echoing faintly in the narrow corridor. The sound of their breathing was the only thing that broke the silence. But Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. It was a gut instinct, one he had honed over years of working in the field. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a large steel door at the end of the hallway. Sophia pulled out a small device and began to work on the lock. The tension in the air was palpable as Clint and Foster stood guard, eyes darting around nervously. "Almost there," Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper. With a soft click, the door opened, revealing a large, dimly lit room filled with rows of computers, servers, and piles of documents. This was it, the heart of the operation. This was where the real intel was being stored. Clint moved first, sweeping the room with his eyes. He didn't see any guards, at least, not immediately, but that didn't mean they weren't there. He motioned for Foster and Sophia to follow. "Get what we need," he said in a low voice. "Fast." Sophia nodded, moving to one of the computers. She quickly plugged in a device and began downloading files. Foster was at her side, scanning through the stacks of papers, looking for anything that might give them a clue about the people behind this operation. Clint kept watch, his hand on his gun, his eyes trained on the door. Every second felt like an eternity. He knew they couldn't afford to be here for long. If they were caught, a sound echoed in the hallway, a footstep, then another. Clint's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone. Move, Clint hissed. Sophia yanked the device from the computer, shoving it into her bag. Foster grabbed the papers he had found, and they turned to make their exit. But just as they were about to reach the door, a voice rang out. Freeze! Clint spun around, gun raised. Two armed guards stood in the doorway, their weapons trained on them. Clint's pulse quickened, but he didn't falter. He knew this was it, the moment where everything would either fall apart or they'd make their escape. Sophia acted first, diving behind a stack of crates, taking cover. Foster followed suit. Clint took a breath and fired. The sound of gunfire echoed in the small room, the sharp crack of the shots deafening. One of the guards went down immediately, but the other fired back, the bullet grazing Clint's arm. Pain shot through him, but he didn't let it slow him down. He ducked behind a pillar, then aimed again, hitting the second guard squarely in the chest. The guard crumpled to the ground, and the room fell into an uneasy silence. Move now, Clint shouted. They didn't waste a moment. They bolted out of the room and back into the maintenance tunnel. The escape was a blur. Darkness, running, the pounding of their hearts, the distant sounds of alarms ringing through the facility. By the time they reached the exit and burst into the cool night air, Clint felt like he could finally breathe again. But he knew better than to relax. The first strike was over, but the war was far from won. The room felt colder than it had a few hours ago. Clint, Foster, and Sophia sat in silence, their minds racing as they stared at the files they'd managed to pull from the underground facility. The quiet hum of the computer in the corner was the only sound that filled the space, a far cry from the gunshots and the chaos they'd left behind in the maintenance tunnels. Clint's arm throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, but the pain was nothing compared to the growing sense of urgency that gripped him. They had barely escaped with their lives, but it was the intel they'd gathered that had the power to change everything. What they had found was more than just documents and data. It was a map, a roadmap to the heart of the conspiracy, and perhaps to the man who had orchestrated it all. Sophia was the first to break the silence. She was hunched over one of the papers, her eyes scanning the text quickly. We're getting closer, she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Clint shifted in his seat. Closer to what? Sophia didn't look up. Closer to the guy at the top, the one pulling the strings. Foster stood by the window, his gaze fixed outside, though his thoughts were far from the view. We still don't have a name. No solid proof. Just more breadcrumbs. Clint leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. We can't afford to chase shadows anymore. We need a solid lead. A name. Something that ties it all together. Sophia let out a long breath. There's one. A name that keeps coming up over and over again in the files. A man who has connections to the highest levels of government, intelligence agencies, and the corporate world. He's been linked to several covert operations across the globe. Clint's eyes sharpened. Who? Sophia finally looked up from the papers, locking eyes with him. Marcus Hale. Foster snorted from across the room. Sounds like a ghost. Never heard of him. Sophia nodded slowly. That's because he's not supposed to be known. He's a shadow. A man who works in the background, pulling strings from the shadows while everyone else believes he's just a myth. But the more I dig, the more I'm convinced. Marcus Hale is the one behind everything. Clint's pulse quickened. The name was familiar, but it didn't make sense. He had spent years in intelligence, had worked with the best in the business, yet he had never heard of Marcus Hale. The more he thought about it, the more it felt like a setup, like someone was trying to steer them in a direction that would only lead to a dead end. What makes you so sure it's him? Clint asked, though a nagging doubt tugged at him. Sophia's expression hardened. Because everything I've seen points back to him. The resources, the connections, the operations. He's the one who can make everything happen. Pull the levers, turn the wheels, and no one even knows he exists. The perfect man behind the mask. Foster stepped closer, leaning over the table. And if he's the one behind it all, why isn't he more visible? Why leave a trail at all? Clint kept watch, his hand on his gun, his eyes trained on the door. Every second felt like an eternity. He knew they couldn't afford to be here for long. If they were caught, a sound echoed in the hallway, a footstep, then another. Clint's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone. Move, Clint hissed. Sophia yanked the device from the computer, shoving it into her bag. Foster grabbed the papers he had found, and they turned to make their exit. But just as they were about to reach the door, a voice rang out. Freeze! Clint spun around, gun raised. Two armed guards stood in the doorway, their weapons trained on them. Clint's pulse quickened, but he didn't falter. He knew this was it, the moment where everything would either fall apart or they'd make their escape. Sophia acted first, diving behind a stack of crates, taking cover. Foster followed suit. Clint took a breath and fired. The sound of gunfire echoed in the small room, the sharp crack of the shots deafening. One of the guards went down immediately, but the other fired back, the bullet grazing Clint's arm. Pain shot through him, but he didn't let it slow him down. He ducked behind a pillar, then aimed again, hitting the second guard squarely in the chest. The guard crumpled to the ground, and the room fell into an uneasy silence. Move now, Clint shouted. They didn't waste a moment. They bolted out of the room and back into the maintenance tunnel. The escape was a blur. Darkness, running, the pounding of their hearts, the distant sounds of alarms ringing through the facility. By the time they reached the exit and burst into the cool night air, Clint felt like he could finally breathe again. But he knew better than to relax. The first strike was over, but the war was far from won. The room felt colder than it had a few hours ago. Clint, Foster, and Sophia sat in silence, their minds racing as they stared at the files they'd managed to pull from the underground facility. The quiet hum of the computer in the corner was the only sound that filled the space, a far cry from the gunshots and the chaos they'd left behind in the maintenance tunnels. Clint's arm throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, but the pain was nothing compared to the growing sense of urgency that gripped him. They had barely escaped with their lives, but it was the intel they'd gathered that had the power to change everything. What they had found was more than just documents and data. It was a map, a roadmap to the heart of the conspiracy, and perhaps to the man who had orchestrated it all. Sophia didn't hesitate. Because he's too smart. He works in the shadows, and if he can keep everyone looking in the wrong direction, he can operate without anyone even noticing. This isn't the first time he's pulled something like this. Clint ran his fingers over the map on the table, tracing the locations that had been marked. It was all beginning to make sense in a twisted sort of way. Hale's fingerprints were everywhere. The operations, the governments, the corporations. He was untouchable. Where do we start? Clint asked, his voice tight. Sophia's lips twitched, a small, almost imperceptible smile. We go after him. We find him, expose him, and bring down the whole damn network. Clint's mind raced. The plan seemed almost too simple, too obvious. But the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like their only option. They had no idea how powerful Hale was, or how far his influence stretched. He could be untouchable, but that didn't mean they weren't going to try. We'll need a strategy, Clint said, the weight of the task ahead settling on his shoulders. And we need to move fast. If Hale's the mastermind, he's already preparing for the next move. Sophia nodded. I agree, but it won't be easy. He has eyes everywhere, and no one gets to the top without making a lot of enemies. We'll have to be careful. Foster grunted in agreement. Careful? We've been careful this whole time, and look where it's gotten us. Clint shot him a look. Careful doesn't mean sitting on our hands. It means being strategic. We need intel, we need connections, and most of all, we need to stay one step ahead. The silence that followed was thick with tension. They were about to make a move that could change everything. One wrong step, and it could all unravel. But the alternative was worse. Staying in the shadows, doing nothing, waiting to be caught. We don't have the luxury of time, Clint said, breaking the silence. We need to move. Now. Sophia pulled out her phone, tapping quickly at the screen. I've got a lead on Hale's current location. We'll start there. Clint stood, glancing around the room. The plan was far from perfect, but it was the only option they had. They couldn't waste time second-guessing themselves. If they were going to take down Marcus Hale, it had to be now. I'll prep the gear, Foster said, already moving to gather their weapons. Clint nodded, his mind already focused on the task ahead. We do this smart. No mistakes. Sophia flashed a rare smile, one that held a mixture of confidence and calculation. This is it. We're not just chasing ghosts anymore. We're going after the man behind the mask. The night air was heavy with the scent of rain as Clint, Foster, and Sophia navigated the narrow alleyways of the city. It was late, the streets eerily empty, and the only sounds were their footsteps echoing off the damp pavement. Clint's mind was in overdrive, processing everything he had learned about Marcus Hale. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but each one seemed to bring more questions than answers. Sophia moved with precision, leading them toward an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place that had popped up on the intel they had gathered earlier. It was one of Hale's suspected operations, a place where shady deals were made and clandestine meetings took place. But it wasn't just the location that had Clint on edge. It was the feeling that they were being watched. The air felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Foster, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. You think we'll find anything useful here? Clint's eyes scanned the area, narrowing as they approached the warehouse. I'm hoping this is the start of something. If Hale is behind all of this, this is where we need to begin. His network, his operations. But we need to be careful. Sophia stopped abruptly and turned to face them. We don't know what we're walking into. This place could be crawling with people loyal to Hale. We need to be quick. Get in, get out, and don't leave a trace. Clint nodded. He knew the risks. He had made a career out of taking risks, but this was different. This wasn't just about completing the mission anymore. It was personal. Marcus Hale wasn't some faceless target. The more Clint learned about him, the more he realized that this man had ties to everything: government corruption, corporate manipulation, and covert operations on a global scale. And now, somehow, Clint was tangled up in it all. Sophia crouched by a rusted door on the side of the warehouse. It's unlocked, she whispered, motioning for them to follow. They moved quickly, slipping into the darkness of the building. The interior was industrial, filled with crates, metal beams, and flickering lights that cast long shadows on the concrete floor. The warehouse smelled of oil and dust, the air thick with the weight of decades of secrecy. Clint felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach, the sensation of being watched never fully leaving him. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct, and instincts kept him alive. They moved through the aisles of crates, checking each one, looking for any sign of the network they were hunting. It was eerily quiet, too quiet. Clint had expected to hear the hum of machinery or the faint sound of voices. Instead, there was only the soft scuff of their shoes against the floor. Sophia led the way, scanning the area. We're getting close, she murmured. Suddenly, the door at the far end of the warehouse creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. Clint instinctively reached for his gun, but Sophia grabbed his wrist, stopping him. Hold up, she whispered. Let me handle this. The figure was tall, wearing a dark suit and carrying a briefcase. He moved with purpose, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting someone. Sophia held up her hand, signaling for Clint and Foster to stay put. Then, without a sound, she slipped out of the shadows and blocked the man's path. The figure froze, eyes widening as he saw her. Who are you? He demanded in a low voice. Sophia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, her posture commanding. You don't need to know that, she said coldly. What you do need to know is that I'm here to take everything you know about Marcus Hale. The man's eyes flickered, and for a split second, Clint saw fear in them. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by defiance. You don't know what you're messing with, he said, his voice a mixture of warning and threat. Hale doesn't take kindly to people poking around in his business. Clint and Foster exchanged a glance, but neither of them moved. They were waiting for Sophia's signal, ready to act if things escalated. Sophia didn't flinch. Tell us what we need to know, or things will get ugly. Fast. The man hesitated for a moment, then seemed to weigh his options. His eyes shifted, scanning the shadows around them. It was a moment of decision, whether to stand his ground or cooperate. Fine, he muttered, finally lowering the briefcase to the ground. You want to know about Hale? He's a ghost. You'll never find him. But the people who work for him, they're the ones who can help you get closer. If you want to get to Hale, you need to go after them first." Sophia motioned for Clint and Foster to step forward. "Go on," she urged. The man swallowed hard, his hand trembling slightly as he reached into his coat and pulled out a small folder. "This contains everything I know. Names, locations, meeting times. If you're smart, you'll follow the trail. But be warned, Hale doesn't leave survivors. He'll come for you if you get too close." Clint took the folder from him, feeling the weight of it in his hands. Inside were documents, maps, and contact details. It was everything they needed to find Hale, but it was also a dangerous game they were about to play. "Get out of here," Clint said, his voice low and commanding. The man didn't need to be told twice. He backed away slowly, glancing nervously over his shoulder as he disappeared into the shadows. "We have what we need," Sophia said, her voice calm but urgent. "Let's move before anyone else shows up." Clint tucked the folder into his jacket and nodded. "Right. Let's get out of here." They moved swiftly, retracing their steps through the warehouse and back into the alleyways. Clint felt the weight of what they had just uncovered, the gravity of their next steps settling over him. This wasn't just a mission anymore. This was a fight for survival. Marcus Hale wasn't just some shadowy figure. They were dealing with a mastermind who had eyes everywhere, whose reach extended far beyond anything they had anticipated. The hunt for Hale had officially begun, and Clint had no illusions about what was coming next. The stakes were higher than ever, and the enemy was closing in. The city was awake, but it felt like a dream. Hazy, quiet, with an undercurrent of danger pulsing beneath the surface. Clint, Sophia, and Foster sat in a dimly lit safe house, a small room tucked away in the heart of the city, the walls lined with old bookshelves and the scent of stale coffee lingering in the air. The flickering screen in front of them illuminated their faces as they pored over the documents they had gathered from the warehouse. Sophia had been the first to crack open the folder, her sharp eyes scanning the pages like a hawk. Clint could see the weight of it on her. This was more than just a mission now. It was a race against time, a race to find Marcus Hale before Hale found them. "We've got 3 possible locations," Sophia muttered, her fingers moving over the map, pinpointing the places that had been marked in the folder. A mansion in the outskirts of the city, a private airstrip about 2 hours north, and a compound just outside of Chicago. Foster leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Any of them have a higher chance of being Hale's base of operations?" Sophia hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the documents once again. "The mansion is connected to some high-profile names. Politicians, CEOs, people who would have a vested interest in Hale's operations. But the airstrip is intriguing. There's been a lot of private air traffic in and out of that place recently. Could be something." Clint stood up, his mind already working through the options. "We don't have the luxury of time. If Hale's pulling strings from one of these places, we need to hit it hard. We need intel, not a fight." Foster grunted. "Hard to get intel when everyone's armed to the teeth." Sophia looked at Clint. "You're the one with the experience, Clint. Which one do you think we should go after first?" Clint rubbed his hand over his jaw, the decision weighing on him. "The airstrip. It's isolated, and we can get in without too much attention. The mansion is too high profile. Too many eyes. If we hit the airstrip first, we can get a better idea of what we're dealing with. Plus, it's the least expected." Foster nodded in agreement. "I'm in." Sophia closed the map, her eyes scanning the team. "We're going in fast and quiet. No heroes, no loud noise. We get in, gather what we need, and get out. If Hale has anything to do with this, we need to be prepared for anything." Clint felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with planning a mission. It was the same feeling he'd had when he was younger, when he'd been a part of some of the most dangerous covert operations in the world. But this wasn't the same. There was no government backing him up, no higher command to answer to. This was personal. And Marcus Hale wasn't some nameless enemy. They had a face now. They had a target. And Clint wasn't about to let Hale slip through his fingers. The airstrip was quiet when they arrived, the moon casting a pale light over the runway. The place felt abandoned, save for the occasional hum of a distant engine or the faint whir of a camera hidden in the shadows. Clint's instincts were on high alert. He had been in enough places like this to know when something felt off. Sophia led the way, moving with the grace and precision of a trained operative. Foster stayed close behind, his body tense, always on the lookout. Clint brought up the rear, scanning the perimeter, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. The airstrip was small, just a few hangars and a small control tower, but it had all the hallmarks of a place used for secretive operations. Private planes coming and going, supplies being shipped under the radar. Clint had no doubt this was one of Hale's key locations. They reached the first hangar, the door slightly ajar. Clint motioned for them to stop. "We check it out," quietly. "No unnecessary risks." Sophia nodded, her movements smooth as she crept toward the door. She peered inside, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. A few moments passed, and then she waved them in. The inside of the hangar was dark, with large crates stacked against the walls. The floor was littered with discarded paperwork and empty boxes. It seemed like an abandoned storage facility, but Clint knew better. There was something about the way the crates were arranged, the way certain areas of the floor had been cleared, that told him this place wasn't as empty as it seemed. Sophia crouched down next to one of the crates, pulling out a flashlight. She flashed it quickly over the contents. "Weapons," she whispered, "and what looks like military-grade equipment." Clint's stomach tightened. "This is bigger than we thought." Foster moved forward, his voice low. "This is just one hangar. Who knows what's in the others?" Sophia nodded. "We can't stay here long. We need to get a look at the other hangars. There's something more going on here." They moved quickly, covering the remaining hangars with the same level of caution. Each one was more or less the same. Hidden military supplies, weapons caches, and crates filled with equipment that didn't belong in a civilian facility. There were no signs of life, no guards, but Clint could sense they were getting closer to something big. Finally, they reached the last hangar. This one was different. The door was completely sealed, and the faintest sound of machinery could be heard from inside. Clint's heart rate quickened. "This is it," he whispered. "We need to break in." Sophia shook her head. "No, we're not breaking in. We're going to do this the right way. We get surveillance, we get intel, and then we move in when we have a clear shot." Clint nodded, though part of him itched to take action. But he knew she was right. They couldn't afford to make a mistake now. They moved back to the safe house to regroup, but Clint's mind was already racing. The pieces were coming together, but they were still missing a crucial element. Marcus Hale. They had the airstrip, they had the supplies, and now they had to figure out how to get to the man who controlled it all. One thing was certain. The closer they got, the more dangerous the trail would become. And Clint wasn't about to stop until he brought Marcus Hale down. The night air in the safe house felt thick, suffocating even. Clint leaned against the table, studying the map that covered the surface, marked with red X's and circled locations. They had gathered information, yes, but the path forward was becoming increasingly unclear. Marcus Hale wasn't just a shadowy figure. He was a master of disappearing into the fabric of the world's most secure places, and each lead they uncovered only seemed to bring more questions. Clint rubbed his temples, exhaustion weighing down on him. They had barely gotten any sleep in the past 48 hours, but there was no time to rest. Every moment they wasted was a moment Hale could use to slip further out of reach. "We've tracked Hale to his private airstrip. We've got weapons shipments coming in and out," Sophia said, breaking the silence. She sounded tense, a mixture of determination and frustration. But no sign of him. No concrete evidence that he's even been at any of the locations. "It's like he's a ghost." Clint's eyes flickered over to her, his mind still processing the night's findings. "He's good at staying hidden, that's for sure. But he's also getting sloppy. These airstrips, these warehouses, they're too exposed. He's setting something up." Foster, who had been pacing in the corner, stepped forward. "You think he's trying to lure us in? Make us chase ghosts?" Sophia raised an eyebrow. "That's exactly what I think. Hale's the type to want us to keep digging, keep wasting time, while he operates in the shadows." Clint's gaze hardened. "Then we need to change the game. We stop chasing the ghost and start controlling the narrative. We need to get to the people who are closest to him, the ones he trusts. If we can get one of them to talk? Which means we're going after Hale's right-hand man, Foster interrupted. Clint nodded. Exactly. Someone who knows where the real action is happening. We get to them, and the whole network unravels. Sophia crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. And how do we get to them? We don't even know who they are yet. Clint stood up and walked over to the map, pointing at a series of interconnected cities. We know Hale has been using various locations as fronts. The warehouse, the airstrip, and the mansion. These people, the ones closest to Hale, are probably tied to these places. There's one man who might be able to lead us to them, Evan Marsh. He's been working with Hale for years. He's the bridge between Hale and his operations. Marsh? Sophia repeated the name like it held weight. Where is he? Clint turned to face her, his expression grim. We've got an address. It's in a small town outside Chicago. But getting to him won't be easy. Marsh is as slippery as they come, and he's always surrounded by a lot of muscle. Sounds like a perfect setup for an ambush, Foster muttered, clenching his fists. We need to be smart about this, Clint said, his voice calm but resolute. No unnecessary risks. We move in, get him, and get out. That's our only option. By the time they arrived in the small town outside Chicago, the sun was just beginning to set, casting an orange hue across the horizon. The air had a chill to it, a reminder that winter was approaching. Clint, Sophia, and Foster parked a few blocks away from the address they had for Marsh, studying the area from a distance. The house was modest, unassuming. There was nothing about it that screamed danger, nothing that would indicate it was the home of one of Marcus Hale's closest allies. But Clint knew better. Appearances were deceiving. They moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, their steps muffled by the damp ground. Clint led the way, with Sophia and Foster flanking him. They reached the perimeter of the property and crouched behind a row of bushes, scanning the area for guards or any signs of activity. It's too quiet, Sophia whispered. That's exactly why it feels wrong, Clint replied. They waited in silence, watching the house. It was clear that Marsh had been tipped off that someone might be coming for him. Every light in the house was on, and there were no signs of movement. It didn't make sense, unless someone was inside with him, someone he trusted. Clint's instincts were screaming at him to act, but he forced himself to wait. They couldn't afford to make a mistake now. They needed Marsh alive. His cooperation was their only chance of reaching Hale. We've got about a 20-minute window, Foster said, breaking the silence. We can go in through the back. Keep it quiet. Clint nodded. Let's move. They made their way to the rear of the house, crouching low to avoid being seen. Clint's mind was focused, his heart rate steady. Every second they spent here could be their last. They reached the back door, and Sophia quickly checked the handle. It's unlocked, she whispered. They entered the house cautiously, staying low and moving in unison. The interior of the house was dim, with only the soft glow of lamps casting shadows on the walls. Clint could hear the faint sound of a TV playing in another room, but there was no sign of Marsh, or anyone else, for that matter. Clint motioned for them to stay put and moved forward, his senses on high alert. The house felt like a maze, with narrow hallways leading to different rooms. He turned a corner and froze. There, at the far end of the hallway, was a man sitting in a chair, his back to them. It was Marsh. He hadn't seen them yet. Clint's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. But just as Clint was about to step forward, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. There was a soft creak behind him, a shift in the air that made him turn just in time. A gunshot rang out. Clint dove to the ground, narrowly avoiding the bullet that whizzed past his head. Foster returned fire instinctively, while Sophia bolted for cover. It was a trap. Marsh had known they were coming, and now they were caught in a deadly game. The sound of the gunshot reverberated in Clint's ears, the sharp crack of the bullet cutting through the silence of the small house. His instincts kicked in immediately, sending him diving behind a nearby table. His body hit the floor with a jarring thud, and the room seemed to spin for a moment. The air was thick with tension as the deafening silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Foster's return fire. Clint scrambled for cover behind the old wooden table, his heart racing. His breath came in short bursts as he slid his hand over the rough surface of the floor, pulling his pistol from its holster. The staccato bursts of gunfire echoed from the other room, followed by the harsh, scraping sound of boots on the wooden floor as the enemy moved into position. "Move. Now," Clint hissed to Sophia, who had already darted behind a sturdy cabinet, narrowly avoiding the incoming bullets. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with urgency but sharp with determination. She nodded once, signaling that she was ready. Foster was at the front of the house, his gun raised, his posture tense. The man had always been a fighter, but now, with the odds stacked against them, Clint knew that they couldn't afford to hesitate. They needed to keep Marsh alive if they were going to get the information they desperately needed, but surviving this firefight was their first priority. "I'll cover you," Clint said to Sophia, his voice steady even though adrenaline was coursing through his veins. Sophia gave a quick nod, her gaze flickering to the hallway where Evan Marsh had been sitting just moments before. The man was no longer in sight. The trap was set, and they were in the center of it. "Foster, keep them pinned down. Sophia, move up and flank them from the left," Clint ordered. The plan was simple, but in situations like these, simplicity was the key to survival. Sophia took a deep breath and bolted from her position, her body moving fluidly as she darted down the hallway. Clint shifted his attention to Foster, whose rifle was now aimed at the door at the far end of the hallway. A moment later, Foster fired a single, controlled shot, and the sound of a grunt echoed back. "Got one," Foster yelled from the other room. "Nice shot," Clint called back, but he knew this was far from over. They had no idea how many enemies were in the house, and Marsh was still unaccounted for. Clint's eyes scanned the room as he prepared to move. They couldn't afford to stay in one spot for too long. The longer they waited, the more likely they were to get surrounded. "Move out now," Clint shouted to Foster and Sophia, taking a steadying breath. He motioned for them to follow as he darted toward the back door, hoping that Marsh hadn't anticipated their movements. He had to be somewhere. They were too close now to lose him. The trio made their way through the hallway and into the rear of the house. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs, and Clint's instinct screamed that it was Marsh. The man had to be up there. As they climbed the stairs with as much stealth as they could manage, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house was eerily quiet now, save for the distant shuffle of footsteps and the low hum of electricity running through the walls. They reached the top of the stairs and moved to the left, where a bedroom door stood ajar. Clint raised his hand to signal for them to stop. His eyes narrowed as he took in the dim, shadowy room beyond. A faint outline of someone was visible inside, and Clint's heart rate quickened as he realized it was Marsh. Clint motioned for Sophia to move to the right side of the room, and he took the left. They would close in from both sides, giving Marsh no escape. "Evan Marsh," Clint called, his voice low but commanding. "We don't want to hurt you, but you're coming with us. Now." There was no response. The man didn't even flinch. It was like he was waiting for something. And then, just as Clint's patience began to wear thin, he heard it, the faintest click, followed by a low mechanical whir. The floor beneath them shifted, the sound of a trap being triggered too late for them to avoid. Sophia whipped around to look at Clint, her eyes wide with alarm, but before she could shout a warning, the floor beneath them erupted in a deafening explosion. The world turned to chaos. Clint's body was thrown backward with incredible force, and everything went dark for a split second. The sound of ringing in his ears was the only thing he could hear, his vision spinning. He hit the floor hard, pain radiating through his chest and skull. But before he could even process the explosion, he heard the sound of footsteps, a rush of boots and voices growing louder. The trap was far worse than anything they'd anticipated. "Clint." Sophia's voice came through the fog in his mind, strong and urgent. He forced himself up, feeling the weight of debris pressing down on his body. He blinked a few times, trying to clear his vision. When his eyes focused, he saw Sophia crouching over him, her expression a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice strained but still sharp. Clint pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest. "I'm fine. Get to Marsh. Now." Sophia looked hesitant for a moment, but she didn't hesitate long. She bolted past him and into the room where Marsh had once stood. Clint followed, but the sight that greeted him was far from what he had expected. Marsh was gone. The room was now a twisted mess of rubble, the walls scarred from the blast. There was no sign of the man. Damn it! Clint spat, frustration and anger bubbling up within him. They had been this close, so close to catching him. Foster rushed in behind them, his gun raised, eyes scanning the debris. They're gone. Whoever set this trap knew exactly what they were doing. Clint's mind raced, piecing together the events. Hale had to be behind this. Every move, every trap, every step they took. It was all part of the web Hale had constructed around them. And now, Evan Marsh was slipping through their fingers once again. "Let's go," Clint said, his voice low and filled with determination. "We find him, and we end this, once and for all." The house was nothing more than a charred skeleton after the explosion. The walls were jagged, the air thick with the smell of burning wood and dust. Clint could feel the heat from the blast still lingering in his chest as he adjusted his jacket, feeling the remnants of the impact in every aching muscle. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, a constant reminder that they had narrowly escaped death. But there was no time for rest, no time to reflect. Not now. Sophia was the first to speak, her voice tight with frustration. "He's gone. He slipped right through our hands." Clint wiped his face with the back of his hand, brushing away the soot that had settled there. "We're not done yet," he muttered. "Marsh couldn't have gone far. He knows we're after him, but we're not giving up that easily." Foster, who had been scanning the wreckage, shot Clint a hard look. "How are we supposed to find him now? The house is destroyed, and he's got a head start. We're blind." Clint gritted his teeth. "We follow the trail. We know Marsh. He's not going to run far. He'll go to ground somewhere. And that's where we'll find him." Sophia gave a curt nod. "So what's the plan?" Clint stepped toward the door, his eyes scanning the yard outside. There were no signs of movement, no vehicles coming or going. But they knew better than to trust appearances. The whole situation reeked of a well-planned escape. "We need to figure out where Marsh would go. He won't risk being far from Hale. Whatever's next, it's all tied to him. We're getting closer. I can feel it." Foster snorted, but there was a glimmer of agreement in his eyes. "Let's hope we're right, because if we're not, Hale's going to make us regret it." Sophia was already reaching for her phone, tapping at the screen with practiced speed. "I'm checking for any movements, any signals that could tell us where Marsh might have gone." Clint's mind raced as he thought through their next move. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. They had no idea how far ahead Marsh was, or how far he'd gotten. They had one shot at this. If they missed it, they might never get another. The sound of Sophia's phone pinging broke the silence, pulling him from his thoughts. "Got something," she said, looking up with a gleam in her eye. Marsh made a call right before he disappeared. It wasn't to Hale, but it was a burner phone. The call came from a spot in the city. "We should move." Clint didn't waste another second. "Let's go. Now." The city felt different after the explosion. The streets were darker, quieter, as if the chaos from the blast had unsettled the entire neighborhood. Clint, Sophia, and Foster navigated the winding roads, their eyes scanning for anything that seemed out of place. Every alley, every corner, every car parked on the side of the street became a potential threat. Sophia kept her eyes on the road as they approached the area where Marsh's phone had pinged. It was a grimy part of town, tucked between two abandoned warehouses. The air smelled of oil and rust, the remnants of a once thriving industrial area now left to decay. "This is it," Sophia said, pulling up to the curb and stopping the car. "He's got to be here somewhere." Clint didn't respond. He was already out of the car, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He could feel the tension building in the pit of his stomach, the feeling that they were being watched, that the walls were closing in. He motioned for Sophia and Foster to follow as he led them toward the alley between the warehouses. "Stay sharp," Clint whispered, his voice low. "We don't know what's waiting for us." They moved swiftly through the alley, their footsteps barely making a sound against the concrete. Clint's eyes darted from side to side, watching for any sign of movement, There was a faint, buzzing sound overhead, the hum of broken streetlights flickering on and off. The further they went, the more it felt like they were walking into the lion's den. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the shadows. Clint's body tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. But it wasn't Marsh. It was a man, tall and lean, wearing a dark jacket. His eyes locked onto Clint, and for a brief moment, neither of them moved. "Who are you?" Clint demanded. The man didn't answer at first. Instead, he stepped forward slowly, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I'm not here to fight," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "But you're looking for Marsh, right?" Clint's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" "My name's Ricky. I know where Marsh is. But you have to understand, this is bigger than him." "It's bigger than Hale," Ricky said, his voice almost a whisper, as if afraid to be overheard. Sophia and Foster exchanged glances, but Clint didn't take his eyes off Ricky. "What are you talking about?" Ricky looked around nervously, then leaned in closer. "Marsh isn't just working with Hale. He's in too deep. You need to get to him before Hale gets to you." Clint felt the weight of Ricky's words sink in. The room seemed to grow colder, the air heavier with every passing second. He had known that Hale was dangerous, but this was more than just a man on the run. "Where is Marsh?" Clint demanded again, his patience running thin. Ricky hesitated, then pulled out a small folded map from his jacket pocket. He handed it over to Clint. "I'm giving you this, but you need to trust me. Hale has people everywhere. Don't let him catch you before you catch him." Clint took the map, his fingers brushing against Ricky's. The tension in the alley was palpable, but Clint didn't have time to process the man's words. They had no choice but to trust him, for now. "Go," Ricky urged. "Hurry." Without a second thought, Clint turned on his heel and sprinted back toward the car, Sophia and Foster hot on his heels. "Did he give you anything useful?" Foster asked as they piled into the car. Clint didn't respond immediately. He unfolded the map, scanning the marked location. "It's a compound. He's hiding out there." Sophia's face tightened. "Then let's go get him." They drove quickly, their hearts pounding in their chests, knowing that the moment they stepped into that compound, it was all or nothing. The car screeched to a halt outside the compound, its tires kicking up gravel as Clint slammed the brakes. He looked out at the facility, his heart thumping in his chest. The compound was an old, fortified warehouse, the kind of place you'd expect a criminal organization to use as a base of operations. The tall chain-link fence surrounding it was topped with barbed wire, and cameras dotted every corner, watching for intruders. Clint felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This was it. If they didn't get Marsh now, they might never get another shot. The only problem was, they had no idea how heavily guarded this place was. They had no intel on the inside. No idea how many men Hale had watching over the compound. "We go in quiet," Clint muttered, his voice low as he turned to Sophia and Foster. "We need to make sure Marsh is still here, and that we don't alert Hale's people. If he knows we're coming, it's over." Foster nodded, his jaw clenched tightly as he adjusted his rifle. "I'm with you. Let's get him before it's too late." Sophia checked the gear strapped to her waist. "And if we get caught?" Clint's eyes narrowed as he glanced over at the compound again. "Then we fight our way out." With that, they moved swiftly, crouching low as they approached the fence. Clint's heart beat in his throat, but he kept his focus sharp. Every noise, every movement, felt like it could give them away. They reached the fence without incident, and Clint gestured for Sophia to start cutting through the wire. The sound of the metal clanking against the ground felt deafening, but they couldn't afford to waste time. The hole in the fence was small, but large enough for all three of them to slip through. Once on the other side, they pressed their backs to the cold concrete wall of the warehouse, staying in the shadows. Clint motioned for them to move quickly, and they crept along the edge of the building, staying low and out of sight. Inside, they could hear voices, faint but growing louder as they neared the entrance. Clint gestured for them to stop and drop to a crouch, his ears straining to pick up anything useful. There was a low murmur of conversation coming from the other side of the wall. "Sounds like a patrol," Foster whispered, his eyes scanning the area. Clint nodded, his mind racing. They'll be out in a minute. When they're clear, we move in. Sophia and Foster nodded in unison, their faces set with determination. They had no intention of failing now. It felt like an eternity, but finally, the voices faded, and the sound of boots hitting the ground grew distant. Clint signaled for them to move forward. They entered the building through a narrow side door, carefully avoiding the main entrance. Inside, the warehouse was eerily silent, the only sound the soft shuffle of their footsteps on the concrete floor. The layout was simple. Rows of metal crates lined the walls, and the space was vast, dark, and cold. It looked abandoned at first glance, but Clint knew better. Hale's people would be hiding in the shadows, waiting for any sign of trouble. They moved deeper into the compound, their eyes constantly scanning for any signs of life. Clint's senses were on high alert, and his hand never strayed far from his gun. He wasn't sure how much time they had, but they couldn't afford to waste it. Marsh had to be close. "We need to split up," Clint whispered. "Foster, take the right side. Sophia, you're with me." Sophia glanced at him. "And if we find Marsh? Get him out. Fast." "We don't have time to play around," Clint replied, his voice hard. The trio split, each taking their designated route through the maze of crates. Clint's eyes darted around the shadows, his mind focused solely on finding Marsh. He could feel the tension growing thicker with every step he took. It wasn't long before he heard the faint sound of movement ahead. His pulse quickened, and he motioned for Sophia to follow. They crept toward the sound, their movements careful and precise. Then they saw him. Evan Marsh was crouched behind a stack of crates, his back turned to them. He was scanning the area, oblivious to their presence. Clint's heart skipped a beat. They had found him, but something felt wrong. Marsh looked different, nervous, even desperate. It wasn't the confident, smug man Clint had encountered before. This Marsh seemed like he was on the edge of something. Was he trying to escape Hale, or was he leading them into a trap? Clint didn't hesitate. He raised his gun and aimed it directly at Marsh's back. "Marsh," he shouted, his voice sharp, "it's over. You're coming with us." Marsh froze for a moment before slowly turning to face Clint. His eyes were wide, panicked. "You're making a mistake," Marsh said, his voice trembling slightly. "You don't know what you're walking into. You have no idea what Hale is capable of." Clint's eyes narrowed. "I'm not interested in excuses. Get up." But Marsh didn't move. Instead, he took a step back, his hand creeping toward a hidden compartment on the crate behind him. Clint's instinct screamed at him to stop Marsh, but it was too late. A sharp, mechanical click filled the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against concrete. The trap had been sprung. Before Clint could react, the floor beneath them opened up, revealing a pit filled with sharp, jagged steel spikes. Clint's body reacted on instinct, his feet skidding backward, but he wasn't fast enough. He fell, his body tumbling down toward the pit below. In that instant, everything seemed to slow down. He could see the horror in Sophia's eyes as she reached out, her hands too far away to grab him. But Clint didn't have time to process it. His heart pounded in his chest as he plunged toward the spikes below. Just as he was about to hit the ground, a sudden jerk stopped him. He gasped for air, the rush of panic coursing through him. Someone had grabbed him, pulling him back up just in time. He could barely register the figure above him. Foster, his grip tight and unwavering. "You okay?" Foster's voice rang in his ears. Clint nodded, his pulse racing. "Let's get out of here now." The trap had been set, and it was only the beginning. Clint's head pounded as he regained his footing, his legs shaking from the close call with the pit. Foster's hand was still gripping his arm, pulling him away from the edge of the deadly trap. Sophia had her gun drawn, her eyes scanning the area, looking for any sign of movement. The tension in the air was thick, heavier than it had ever been before. "You good?" Foster asked, his voice urgent but steady. Clint nodded, his breath ragged. "Yeah, let's move." The trap had been close, too close, but they couldn't afford to dwell on it. The time for hesitation had long passed. They had come this far. There was no turning back now. Clint's gaze flicked to Marsh, who was still standing near the stack of crates, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. He hadn't expected them to get this far. He hadn't expected them to survive the trap. "You should have listened," Marsh said, his voice strained. "Hale isn't the one you need to be worried about. It's me. I'm the one you should have been trying to stop from the beginning." Clint took a step toward him, his body tense with anger. "You've been playing us this whole time, haven't you, Marsh? Leading us straight into Hale's hands." Marsh swallowed hard, his face pale. "No, you don't get it. Hale's just the beginning. The real danger is bigger than anything you can imagine. If you don't stop me, if you don't stop what's coming, you won't just be fighting Hale. You'll be fighting something much worse." Sophia stepped forward, her eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about? If you think we're just going to let you walk away after everything you've done—" "I'm not walking away," Marsh interrupted, his voice sharp. "I'm trying to save you. All of you. You think Hale's the one pulling the strings? You're wrong. There's a group behind him, a powerful force that controls everything. Hale is just a pawn. I'm trying to stop them from triggering something that will destroy everything you know." Clint's mind raced. Everything about Marsh's words felt like a riddle, half-truths and cryptic warnings. But one thing was clear. There was more at play here than they had ever imagined. Before Clint could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. A deep, rumbling voice followed, one Clint recognized all too well. "You're all too late." The shadows at the far end of the room shifted, and out from the darkness emerged Marcus Hale, flanked by two of his armed men. He stood tall, his posture confident and commanding, his cold eyes fixed on Clint. "You think you're so clever, don't you, Clint?" Hale continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "You thought you could stop me. You thought you could just waltz in here and take me down like you've done to so many others. But you've underestimated me." Clint's grip on his gun tightened, but he didn't raise it. He wasn't about to let Hale have the upper hand. "I'm not here for you, Hale. I'm here for Marsh. And I'm not leaving without him." Hale chuckled darkly. "You still don't get it, do you? Marsh isn't the real threat. I'm just the messenger. The real danger is already in motion. And by the time you figure out what's happening, it'll be too late." "Enough with the cryptic bullshit," Foster snapped, his finger twitching on the trigger of his rifle. "Tell us what's going on." Hale smiled, an almost predatory grin that sent a chill down Clint's spine. "You really want to know? Fine, I'll tell you. But I think you're going to regret it." He stepped forward, his boots echoing in the stillness of the warehouse. "You see, there's something bigger than me. Something that goes all the way to the top. I'm not just some street-level operator, Clint. I'm part of something much more powerful. This entire operation, everything you've been chasing, it's all part of a larger plan. A plan that's already been set in motion." Clint's stomach dropped as he processed Hale's words. "You're telling me you're just a cog in the machine? That this goes higher than you?" Hale's smile widened. "Exactly. And now that you're involved, you've become part of it, too. You've been chasing shadows, Clint. But the real players have already made their move." Before Clint could respond, Marsh spoke again, his voice low and frantic. "You have to stop it. If Hale is telling the truth, then everything you've worked for is about to be destroyed. You have no idea what's coming. This isn't just about power or money. It's about control over everything." Clint could feel his world starting to crumble. The pieces weren't fitting together. Nothing made sense. But one thing was certain. They were running out of time. "What's the plan, then?" Clint asked, his voice filled with resolve. "What do we need to do?" Hale's eyes gleamed with amusement. "The plan is already in motion. There's nothing you can do to stop it now. The system's already been infiltrated. It's too late to change anything." Clint's mind raced. If what Hale was saying was true, they were standing at the brink of something much bigger than they had imagined. They hadn't just been chasing Hale, they had been playing into a much larger game. And now they were caught in the crossfire. Clint glanced at Sophia and Foster. "We have one shot at this. We can't back down now." But before he could take another step, the sound of gunfire rang out. The world around Clint erupted in chaos. Bullets whizzed past him, narrowly missing as he ducked behind a stack of crates. Foster fired back, his rifle barking. But the shots were met with a deafening silence. Hale's men had opened fire, and this time, they weren't aiming to miss. Sophia pulled Clint to the ground, her gun already in her hands as she returned fire. "We need to get out of here," she shouted over the noise. "We're surrounded." Clint's heart pounded as he looked for an escape route. Marsh was still standing there, a figure caught in the middle of the storm. But it was clear now. Hale's plan was bigger than any of them had anticipated, and they were right in the center of it all. "We're not done yet," Clint gritted out, his voice hard. "We're getting out of here, and we're taking Hale down with us." With a fierce determination, Clint grabbed Sophia's arm and pulled her toward the back exit. Foster followed closely behind, keeping their attackers at bay. They had one chance to stop the madness, one chance to expose Hale for what he was. And if they didn't act now, they would be swallowed whole by the forces they had underestimated. As they ran toward the exit, Clint could only think of one thing. This was the final gamble. If they didn't succeed, everything they had worked for would be lost. Clint's pulse raced as he pushed open the rusted metal door to the back exit, leading into the cold, dark alleyway outside the compound. His mind was spinning with everything that had happened in the last few hours. Marsh's cryptic warnings, Hale's cryptic threats, and now the realization that they were up against something much larger than they could have ever anticipated. The conspiracy was deep, but they were running out of time and out of options. Sophia and Foster were right behind him, their footsteps echoing in the narrow alley. But there was no time to think about that now. They needed to move fast and get out of here before Hale's men cornered them again. They had barely made it past the first round of gunfire, and now they had to survive long enough to take Hale down once and for all. "Go, go, go," Clint hissed, pulling them along faster as they sprinted toward the street. They burst through a side gate, and Clint immediately scanned the area. The streets were mostly empty, the kind of quiet suburban sprawl where no one would notice a sudden shootout between a few desperate individuals and a criminal syndicate. "They're probably already setting up roadblocks," Foster muttered as he jogged beside Clint. "We need to get out of the city." Sophia shot a glance behind them. "And where do you suggest we go? They're going to be hunting for us." Clint's mind whirred. If they didn't get out of the city, they'd be sitting ducks. They needed to lay low. They needed answers, real answers, about what Hale was trying to do. And there was only one person who might have those answers. "North. We need to get to the cabin. It's isolated. We can figure things out there," Clint said. "Yeah, and then what?" Sophia shot back. "Hope for the best? You know this is bigger than us now. Even if we get there, they'll be waiting for us." "I know," Clint replied, his voice steady despite the situation. "But we don't have any other options. We've come this far, and we're not backing down now." They made their way to Clint's car, parked in an alley further down the street, and within seconds, they were speeding away, heading for the outskirts of town. The tension in the air was thick, the weight of everything they'd learned hanging over them. As the city skyline faded in the rearview mirror, Clint tried to piece together everything that had happened. Hale had been a pawn in a larger game, but who was pulling the strings? What was the real goal? And why had Marsh been so insistent that they stop him? Was he warning them because he felt guilty, or was there more to his story? As they drove deeper into the countryside, the streets became emptier, the trees taller, and the sky darker. The cabin was tucked away in a secluded area, far from prying eyes, far from anyone who could connect them to the chaos they just escaped. Clint slammed the brakes when they reached the cabin, sending gravel skittering in every direction. He cut the engine, and for a moment, there was only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The world felt eerily calm, but Clint knew better than to relax. They were just one step closer to the truth, and the danger was far from over. They all piled out of the car and rushed into the cabin, locking the door behind them. Clint's eyes immediately landed on the old wooden table in the center of the room, where an assortment of maps and documents had been scattered. Sophia had already started flipping through them, her brows furrowed in concentration. "Anything?" Clint asked. Sophia shook her head. "Not yet. It's all encrypted, but I think I can crack it." Foster, pacing near the window, looked out into the darkness. "We don't have a lot of time. We need to move before Hale's men show up." Clint turned to the maps, his mind racing. There had to be something here, some clue that would point them toward the next step in this massive puzzle. As he sifted through the documents, one piece of paper caught his eye. It was a receipt for a private jet, destination, Geneva. Clint's stomach dropped. Geneva? That's where the highest levels of the conspiracy were operating. That's where the key players were. And if they didn't stop them now, the entire world would be at risk. This is it, Clint muttered, his voice low. Hale was just a stepping stone. We need to get to Geneva. Sophia's eyes widened. Geneva? How the hell are we supposed to get there? And what's waiting for us when we do? Clint didn't have the answers to that. But one thing was certain. They couldn't afford to waste time. Hale had played them, but now it was time to turn the tables. Suddenly, the sound of tires crunching on gravel echoed outside. It was too late. They had found them. Clint grabbed Sophia's arm. We need to move. Now. They raced to the back door of the cabin, but before they could make it, the door slammed open. Two of Hale's men stormed in, guns drawn. Clint's instincts kicked in. He pulled his pistol from his holster and fired. The first man crumpled to the floor, but the second one fired back. The bullet missed Clint by inches as he ducked behind the wall, taking cover. Sophia, get to the car. Clint shouted, his voice sharp. Foster, cover us. Sophia didn't hesitate. She bolted toward the back of the cabin, her hand on her gun, ready for anything. Foster opened fire, keeping the second gunman pinned behind the doorframe. Clint didn't wait. He ran after Sophia, making his way to the car. They needed to get out of there before reinforcements arrived. The stakes were higher than ever. Hale's men were relentless, but they had no choice but to keep pushing forward. Sophia slammed the car door behind her just as Clint jumped into the driver's seat. They sped off, the tires kicking up dirt as they tore through the forest, the sound of gunfire fading behind them. They didn't look back. We're not done yet, Clint said, his voice grim. But we will be. Soon. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?